Hello, remote people. Can you hear us?
We can.
Fantastic. Good to hear you. Do we have everyone back, or enough people back to start? See a couple of empty chairs, but most people seem to be here. So, and could someone close the doors back there, perhaps? Only one is fine. So, I think we've put a pin in the vocabulary document for the time being. It sounds like we have some fruitful directions to go in on that. We've got the rest of today to talk about attachment. Tomorrow, I think we'll talk about next steps, potential future meetings, the logistics of making sure that we can use our time in between them successfully. The mailing list has been sporadically busy, but I think we need to be able to work asynchronously more if we want to meet our deadlines. So we should figure out how to do that. But if we have some extra time tomorrow, I think we'll use that for attachment as well, likely. But we do need to finish it promptly at noon tomorrow, so we have a limited window. So we have attachment by location, the potential use of robots.txt or another mechanism. So let's talk through that. And then we have attachment by embedding in different formats, as well as in things like HTTP headers. I think probably the large animal in the room is the attachment by location, so I'd suggest we start there first. Okay.
Can I nominate a different note taker?
Oh, you want to pass the baton. Fair enough. Thank you for your service. Can we have a volunteer for someone else to take notes for the afternoon, or if need be, a portion thereof? This is where the room gets very quiet. And some people studiously avoid eye contact. Well, those who have already provided service need not worry. I don't think we'll avail ourselves again.
I think the people looking away the hardest, like, kept talking. I think
You do draw attention to yourself.
Sarah's like really looking away.
We're looking for someone to take notes for the afternoon, if you are interested.
Go. Just make it up.
Anyone?
Ours looks like
It's a difficult topic, so I can do it, but I don't promise a TED quality.
But that is a high bar, so that's fine. Our usual advice is just try and capture the major points made, and especially any kind of emerging leanings, or I won't call them decisions because that's not how they work, but kind of conclusions of discussions. And if folks could help Fars out in the notes and add some color to what she writes, that would be really helpful.
especially about your own comments, like, and there's a recording anyway, so like you don't have to worry about it. Previously, we didn't have like recordings of all these things, so people cannot go and look.
But we don't want to rely on the recording.
Yeah. Just high level stuff you can put in so people can look at it.
Sure, I'll do it.
I'm just going to suggest we do the easy one first, so that we understand it, and hopefully do that quickly.
Which is the easy one?
I think the unit-based one is easier, and the location-based one is trickier.
Well, in somewhat, the spread of unit-based IETF formats is relatively limited. So I think we, more than anything for unit-based, we need just an existence proof to make sure that it's workable. And then, in JPEG and PNG and all the other lovely places, we need to do the liaison work and have those discussions. So did you have something specific in mind, or?
So I think we need to understand the abstract notion of what it is that we understand the semantics to be once we have something like that. And I think that the HTTP one is unit-based.
Or close enough to serve
Or
purpose.
close enough to have the same sort of
It's HTTP or HTML?
HTTP in this case.
An HTTP header
Oh, in the header.
or trailer. Sorry.
Header field.
Thank you. Ooh, Julian. Yeah.
He's looking over my shoulder again.
Of course.
So I don't know if you,
Yeah, I think that's reasonable, just to warm us up perhaps, before the lunchtime food coma kicks in. So HTTP header field, let's talk about it.
We like it.
They're good.
Okay, that's good, done. Okay, next.
all right.
So yesterday we talked about how do we map the vocabulary to, you know, the attachment mechanisms, and I think we kind of had the direction that we would have an abstract model, we would have a preferred serialization or a recommended serialization, and that serialization might be based upon something like structured fields. Was one of the things that was discussed. If we just assume that with rapid hand waving that we eventually go in that direction, that creates an obvious mapping to, okay, then we just need to choose a field name, right?
I think Joe.
Joe?
Can I kick off a response to this by saying that I think there's probably varying degrees of technicality about what this means in the room. I have been sitting blissfully listening to talk about serializations, and frankly, don't know why serialization is relevant yet, because it's not something that I really know very much about. So I definitely would appreciate, I don't know, some context setting on what some of the vocabulary means maybe.
Sure.
But the particular context where I'm not sure if HTTP headers is the right response, again, not knowing enough about the structure of HTTP. When I've spoken to lots of rights holders, one issue is we know there are these massive registries in Lion or Bookstreet, whatever it is, that are URLs that end in .pdf or .jpeg or PNG. What I want to make sure is that if someone hits that, they either hit some kind of metadata tag that was originally on that, on an HTML document, or otherwise go and check a domain, you know, .ai.text or something like this. But if we have the preferences in HTTP headers, if it's a hypertext protocol, will they be returned if I go to a .png URL?
Yes.
They will.
So I'll give
That means.
a brief overview, I guess. So HTTP is a protocol where there's a distinction between content and metadata. The content is the PDF or the image or the HTML, and then the headers is the metadata. There are also trailers. We'll ignore that for the time being because most people do ignore them. But headers are just a series of key value pairs, and they indicate things like the content type, which is useful so your browser knows what to do with that content, although there's lots of hand waving around that. The date that it was sent from the server, caching metadata, things like that. And they're very commonly used to convey other information, generic information about the content, because it is relatively easy in some circumstances, not all, but in some, for the server to add new headers to the content. So especially if I have a website and it has lots and lots of content on it of different kinds, you know, a location-based approach like robots.txt, all of the information about all that diverse set of information on that huge server has to be in one file, which can become quite unwieldy. The advantage of an HTTP header is that it applies, its implicit scope is just that one document, that one response. And so there are ways to configure various HTTP servers to take advantage of that and set policies so the right headers are admitted on the right responses. And so it's very much a one-to-one mapping. And so you can be quite granular. And so for certain use cases, I think the idea here is that this could be quite useful. Not all, but for some.
So can I do two follow-up questions?
Sure.
Clarifying. One, is it impossible or unreasonable to have vocabulary, in a robot.txt that says, for this website, you must look header by header? Because some people don't want a simple solution. No, immediately from Fabrice. I think if ease of use from rights holders, some of them are going to say, I'm trying to set up headers. What I want is to see a robot.txt that says get lost.
Right.
And some people are going to want to say, no, I can do headers. And it might be good to be able to say, you can point from robots to headers.
Absolutely, you should be able to do.
Right.
So the second thing is,
Philosophically.
is there any circumstance in which you would be crawling data, but you would not be able to get headers?
So I suspect that we're going to be in a situation where for some servers, it's going to be more convenient to use robots.txt. In other servers, it's going to be more convenient to use headers. And how that balances out is anybody's guess. Maybe robots.txt, we'll see. One way you could address that certainly is to have an explicit mechanism that says, no, you have to pay attention to headers on the server, and we can talk about that if we get to it. It may be that that's already taken care of by the combination rules that we've been talking about as well, where you have to pay attention to both and then figure out what the end output is. and we'll get to that as well. So perhaps we can put a pin in that. In terms of if you're crawling the web, my understanding is the scrollers generally always keep headers. They may subset the headers that they keep, but that information is always available at request time. The only time you don't get the headers is if you're using HTTP 0.9, which nobody does anymore.
There's no kinds of content, I don't know, streaming kinds of content, for example, where headers aren't supplied in this protocol.
They're still supplied. Streaming gets a little bit interesting because people do interesting things to HTTP, and they shoehorn weird other protocols on top of the HTTP. And as they do so, they become more and more disconnected from the protocol itself. But the headers are still sent. I think when you get to something like, I guess one of the more extreme examples of that is a new protocol called MASK, which is shoehorning an IP connection or a TCP connection or a UDP stream over an HTTP connection. And the connection between those headers and the content inside is very tenuous indeed.
Thank you for sure.
So this would be like what he's talking about is like the Apple private relay. If you heard about it, is kind of based on that, right? Like, so there is like multiple layers of things in there.
But I would say that those total protocols probably don't care about what the preferences expressed at the higher level are. So,
And there's also like in addition to it, I think like we're having this discussion on lunch is that there's also embedded content in it, right? Like that could have different things and
right, and so I think what our charter kind of implies is we're moving towards a world where preferences are discovered by location, preferences are discovered embedded in the content itself, like in the PDF metadata. XMP was mentioned the other day, for example, or it's in the HTTP headers. And those are kind of the three intuitive places to look. I know there's also been discussion of things like registries and kind of other mechanisms. That's why we have this combination.
By location, you mean like robots.txt or something?
Yes, exactly. So, robots.txt is one answer to the by location question.
I think
Yeah, so with respect to HTTP headers, I think there's actually two aspects we need to talk about. One is the header is the header itself when it's, I hate to use the word, but I'll say embedded in the HTTP stream. But there's also the idea in HTTP, as we know, with linked headers or linked relations. So which is a field of the HTTP header and enables you to reference external data elsewhere. And I will point out that this is a mechanism that is actually in use today with C2PA data. So we have clients today that use the IANA registered link header for C2PA data so that they can keep the data separate from the asset. So it's still unit-based, but they're physically detached. And that this way clients can fetch the C2PA data as needed for this purpose. So I would say that when we talk about HTTP headers, we should also be considering link headers for that reason as well, because they fall into the same category.
I will give you a yes and answer to that.
Okay.
Link headers are defined in RFC 8288, and that actually defines a framework for link relations, which link headers are a part of. But it has the concept of applications that specify the use of link relations. And they specify the different serializations that they can use. So link headers is one of those, but it also can be embedded in formats, and this kind of, it's turtles all the way down. So I think we probably need to consider link relations, if we go there, as a separate form of attachment in and of itself.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I hear where you're going.
Sorry, but I say that as the author of RFC.
No, I understand. I'm not disagreeing with your technical position. What I would say is, again, and this was just things that have been said elsewhere around the table, we should very clearly take into consideration things that are already out there in the real world that are relevant to the scenario.
Sure.
And that would be so that I think referring to, as I said, an IANA defined link relation header that can point to a location, that a well-established mechanism for finding this data elsewhere is something we should be talking about as well. I'm not saying we should invent something new,
right?
But this is all, should be part of our consideration. Is all I'm doing.
Sure. I think just in terms of how we structure the discussion, that's a separable chunk of work. That's all.
Yeah.
But an interesting one. Sure.
So we had a lot of discussion about this at lunchtime, which is why I suggested we talk about it first. the proposal that I put together says that this is content-related headers. And there's this sort of loose concept in HTTP, which is never really formalized in any particular way, but you have these very loose that basically says this content is not about the transaction that you're conducting right now, but really this is something about the content, the type of content that it is, the encoding rules for the content, those sorts of things are properties of the content. And to a large extent, that's a really good way of making sure that something gets attached to that content. Because as Mark observed, there's a lot of systems out there that take those headers and keep them with the content as it goes through. In fact, in a lot of cases, if you're taking stuff off websites using HTTP and you're not saving certain headers, then you've lost key information about how to use that content. And so if we use it that way, we are effectively defining what I think is this unit-based thing. I don't like Leonard's indirection, but I think we should definitely discuss that as a possibility in the space. I think it's every time you add a layer of indirection, you loosen the couplings in ways that can sometimes be uncomfortable. And that's why I think the robots.txt thing is a little more tricky to work through. But it's a definite possibility here, particularly since you can use that indirection in powerful ways in some cases.
It's also useful when the people who manage the server are not the same people who manage the content.
Right, and so you can use that. I don't think we need to concentrate in this group on the specifics of different formats. I think if we define a header, we sort of naturally, through the meta tags in HTML, solve the problem. If that's what we want to, if that's how they want to solve that problem, you can sort of say in HTML, just here's what the equivalent of an HTTP header field is. I'm just embedding it into content, and those are possibilities as well. I think we need to regard the headers as something that we should just do it, and we should make it as simple as the expression itself is, with nothing else.
I think, like, to Mark's point, there's only a few of these things that we can do in the IETF, right? Like, that's HTTP is probably one of them, and the REP robots.txt is probably another, and I cannot think of anything else, right? Like, so maybe that's an easier thing to do, Mark.
I propose the thing that works.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, it's your turn.
Is there any other
idea what I wanted to say? I think I wanted to get back to you on robots.txt specifically, that you can do very interesting stuff with robots.txt, and I like some people consider it more advanced. I think it's just like playing around, but it's like basically you can set up rules such that you can match very specific patterns. So for example, if you don't want PDF specifically to get
Asterisk for PDF, right?
Yeah, then you can do something like star.pdf and then a $sign to close the
End of line.
Yeah, end of line. Or you can do stuff like I don't know, PDF files in this directory, but not this one. So basically, you can craft these very elaborate rules about like where you want what to happen, and then back to Mark's point about headers. Somehow he knows so much about HTTP. I don't know how, but with headers, the nice thing about the robots headers. So if you think about robots exclusion protocol, that's practically two things. One is the robots.txt, and the other one is the currently xrobots tag header. And I'm trying to change that into robots tag header to make it more modern, but anyway. And the meta tag, yeah, but that's with W3C, so I'm not talking about it. you can, with the URI level controls, you only have like a set of things that you can specify right now. So it's like no index, no snippet, no archive, and some stuff that we are required to support due to GDPR stuff like max snippet length or whatever it's called. I don't know what it's called. And back to marketing, like if we are launching a new header, then we will have to figure out like how these things can work together, because search engines will need to obey the law that we have here in the UA about GDPR, or the GDPR law, I guess. But then also comply somehow whatever the new header is, and what if there's conflicts between the two? So for example, the thing that I mentioned to Fabrice, like what if we have something like TDM TDM yes, but then a no index? Like
That's fine.
like what am I supposed to do? And then of course we can define that, like how the two should interact with each other. But I think that that's a very hurdles that it will be very difficult to get everyone on the same page.
So, sorry, could you say a bit more? Because we've been talking about this combination concept for a while now. What makes that a perilous path?
Oh, then I don't understand the combination part, I think.
Well, I think
We might have to define, well, I think Gary's talking about no index as the robots text.
So we are already supporting one set of rules.
all right. So you're talking about transitioning from your proprietary rules to the standards one, effectively.
Well, proprietary. It's not proprietary.
It's proprietary.
Take your
Yeah,
Sure.
okay. We'll take it to the side.
context elsewhere, but we need to work out how it combines, I think, with robots text if we.
So you're saying the combination problem is not only between different sources of what we define, but also with existing,
Yeah, and it may just be that the expressions.
especially the
in
direct
robots-
search. Yeah.
It may be that the expressions in robots text map onto our abstract definitions cleanly, and it may be the case that they don't, and we need to work out what the implications of that is. If they map cleanly, then the combination rules we define should answer the questions that we have. But
But then we still have a question for later today, whether robots is the right place for these expressions.
But especially if we are going to attempt to address the search cases, as we discussed yesterday,
Yeah.
this is relevant.
For the search cases, but if, it doesn't mean that they're, but that would, and again, if, depending on where we go later today, if robots, yes, for your search preference, but if we were to have another place for all of your other preferences, then one for one and one for the other. Again, if we go down that, depending on which path we go.
Yeah. So, yes, just to respond to this previous discussion, if there's multiple sources of information, then we have to have an algorithm for combining them. That's a big separate discussion probably. Kind of a cue to talk about something else. Sort of there's a lot of these details, but we up-level this a little bit. What it seems to be the case here is that basically whoever is serving content can do whatever of the mechanisms that we have for expressing preferences. And then the receiver of that information needs to support all of them in order to catch everything that is being said. Unless, of course, you have some negotiation, but even if you have negotiations, you need to support things, or if you can't support it, then you have to fail. And then there's a problem of if we define, let's say, 3 things that you can do: robots.txt, HTTP header, and inside the content. And now if you add a 4th one, let's say the link relation header, if you don't support that, then you're missing somebody's preference. What do you do?
If you can't prove the objectionable preferences, then maybe the assumption is you shouldn't use the context at all.
Yeah, but how do you know that you know everything? Or
If you don't support one of the 4 options, then presumably you say, I don't support.
yeah, but how do you know that there's not a 5th option that was introduced last week?
Well, you don't necessarily,
Presumably
that's
that
where
would be-
policy comes in. I mean, look at the TDM exception today. It just says, you should be able to state your preference, but it doesn't say anything about how.
When I think about this, I suspect we may need a registry of attachment mechanisms.
What?
A registry of attachment
Did you
mechanisms.
say registry?
Yes.
Because,
No.
Something authoritative to say this is the different way you should
No.
discover this.
The methods of attachment not part of our proposal then?
Sorry?
Is the list of mechanisms of attachment not part of our delivery?
We have deliverables for some attachment mechanisms, but not all attachment mechanisms.
And is it not an assumption that this, whatever standard we write would include, these are the attachment mechanisms that are part of this?
No, it will say these are attachment mechanisms, you don't say these are the. I think that's
Yes,
fine,
yes.
because there could be stuff in the future that we don't know right now.
Registry lets us have a list of extensible without remodifying the original.
so registry may help, but ultimately the question is like, what do you actually do in an implementation? And one trick that we played in standards in this kind of context before is that, well, you select, three things are the mandatory ones, and then you may have some optional ones, and maybe we'll eventually edit the list of mandatory ones, and then everybody
That's
has to
another
take
approach.
note.
Sure.
That's
Sure.
one approach.
Yeah.
But when we get down to content-based attachment mechanisms, which formats are you required to understand?
Yeah, and it's not entirely IETF defined either, so it's
Exactly.
not an organization problem.
So there are some fun issues in there.
Okay, really, it sounds like a very expensive way of buying flexibility when we're planning on we have an aggressive charter, as you said many times, we're going to revisit this issue. Why not just say now, these are the attachment mechanisms?
Because we cannot predict the future. I think the point is.
We can
right,
always
we
add
do
them
the-
later.
What is it?
So a large part of, one of the big challenges of engineering protocols for the internet is making sure that we can adjust them in the future, extend them and evolve them. And these are techniques that we often use to make sure we can do that in a reasonable way. Because we don't know all the implementations, we can't control all the implementations. And so we have to kind of build this flexibility in from the start.
Yeah, I have something about this, but I don't.
Yeah, okay, Fabrice, yeah, you done?
Yeah.
Okay.
So 100% on HTTP header, this is when needed. This is used a lot today on the internet to no index the content, to filter private content from surfacing in search engine and elsewhere. So clear value. I think there is a value of reusing the no index, existing no index, X robots tag. Why? Because first it's built-in content management system. It's built-in firewall that will allow the HTTP to be published. And obviously it's used by search engine today as tags. So maybe this is just about the value and where this will be expressed. It will be in the X robots tag.
Thank you. Fabrice? Mark, and then me. I put myself for both.
Gary just reminded me of one other aspect of HTTP headers which is relevant. When you have a separate source of information of authority like robots.txt, operationally for a lot of people, that increases the risk that there's a discontinuity between the actual state of the content and what's in that map effectively. And so the closer the metadata is to the data, the more likely it is to be accurate. And that's very advantageous for some people.
And more importantly, this is when we fetch it at the same time.
Yes.
We fetch the HTTP header. So we have,
It comes packaged with it.
yeah, this is the package. This is, we get it and we are attaching to it.
That's all.
Okay. So I think to Yari's point, most of these are going to be best effort, right? Like if there's like 4 mechanisms and I only read 3, that's all I read. Like, this is not really an audit thing. We decided that this thing was out of scope really for the group. So I would just say we specify it and then maybe at some point talk about what is mandatory to use or not, but I don't think there's like anything more we can do at this point, right? Like we cannot say, hey, you should see this, because I'm not sure like why we want to go down that path of saying, hey, I only read 3 or 4. And I don't want to actually go into the path that Joe is saying, oh, like if you don't read all 4, like you cannot use it. is probably the direction I don't want to go in, right? Like, because we say like, hey, we are trying to do whatever we can, and then if the other things I don't know about them, right? And as I said, like, it's not something we want to audit at this point, because like the audit thing is certainly out of scope. Because even if they did all four, how do you ensure that they comply with it, right? So I think we're going down like a path that we cannot actually, it's not actually feasible for us to control.
You still have to make a reasonable effort, I think.
Yeah.
A reasonable effort, I think, would be to do the three things on the floor that they are now.
If you do
under
three things, you
discussion.
do the three things and you go from there, right? I think it's best effort, really. So, thanks. Paul?
Yeah, I'm trying to look at this from the other side, like from how does this attach that to sort of regulation and law? And sort of, I have one very practical one. So this is ongoing process around the codes of practice, where this is actually like a very contentious issue where like a lot of the dividing lines are between, I think broadly the AI developers arguing it should be robots TXT only. Sometimes like there's a bit of like also terminology issue. Most people will say robots TXT. I think the chairs have tried to sort of refer to the RFC and robots exclusion protocol. And this list of other things, like I think the industry, the AI industry is trying to basically make that as short as possible. And the rights holders are largely frustrated that nothing appears on that list in addition to robots TXT. So this is also like a very contested space, and I think questions about, is this a best effort obligation or requirement to comply will more likely be determined in the regulatory context than in the standard setting context. But the interface is interesting to keep in mind that this is from both ways, and I have a very specific question to this, which is not entirely sure. They say employ web crawlers as specified in the RFC and any subsequent version of this IETF standard. Is there such a thing as subsequent versions of RFTs that
Yes.
are clearly indicated? So this is language that works?
Yep.
Okay.
Then
I'm going to drop for now. I'll jump back in later.
Mark?
So there's a bit of discussion on the chat about who is making claims and who gets to make claims. And I think Paul, in his discussion yesterday on his draft, I think hit the nail on the head in terms of what it is that we can accomplish here and what is practical. This notion of declaring party removes any question of whether that party has this is sort of implied, whether they have the right to be making claims about what's allowed and what isn't allowed. We're not doing that. We're saying it is my preference that this content be treated this particular way. And that's something that anyone can say, independent of whatever legal authority they have as a rights holder or what have you. And to me, that sort of makes it makes the HTTP header very much appropriate for this, not just because it's proximal and convenient and has wonderful scaling properties in the sense that we don't have to worry about the details of attaching metadata to specific formats, PDF. How do we do that with text files, by the way?
Shebang?
No,
You don't embed.
you just can't, right? So there will be formats for which this is going to be the only option. And so that combination of things to me says that this is the absolute right thing for us to be doing. And not just because it's convenient for Fabrice, even though that's a great property. I think that this is exactly.
So, I mean, as I said, I mean, I think the HTTP headers are great. That to me is not the issue. I think it's the other thing I will point out is, we've talked about this in the mailing list as well. I think we all agree that we're not going to solve for the myriad of file formats here, and that's fine. But I think that, and again, I'm biased in this fashion, There are other standards, and CTP being a good example of this, that has dealt with that problem in defining how to put its information in these myriad of file formats and deal with them as standalone, as streaming, because that's been our purpose, is to make this information accessible. And I think that, you know, as long as we recognize that and potentially connect it in here appropriately, as it is a, you know, open standard that can be normatively referenced by an IETF RFC, you know, there should be no problem in doing so. And then in some ways we can push that, assume, you know, with the expectation that it connects into the abstract data model that we're going to define. So that if we have that abstract data model, potentially even the defined serializations, we connect all of the dots accordingly. And then we can push off the problem to somebody else.
So a couple questions I'm going to ask to help me understand the scope of what we're talking about. First question is, in media formats, it's very common to have container structures where I have multiple different embedded things. A very common one is I'll have one or more video streams, elements, and then one or more audio elements, and then possibly one or more captioning track elements
100%.
in the stream. Is our intention that the work we're creating here would be a single policy set attached to the container? Or is it a policy set, each of those embedded container elements can have a embedded policy expression? What is our direction we think we're going?
Well, I can tell you what we do, and you can decide whether you like that or not. We support both models. In that you can have a single, to use your terminology, container level declaration, or you can have a single, what we call them ingredients, but track level, because ingredients aren't necessarily at a track level. They could even be at a sub-track level. But
Well,
yes.
what is our intention as
Yeah, and that's right.
here?
And that's a good question. I'm just giving you an example of one
Right.
existing approach.
And for the ITF people in the room, as we think through that scenario, let me give you an ITF specific scenario. So I have a quick connection. Are we applying this to the policy set for the quick connection, or are we applying it at the individual streams inside the quick connection? Can each quick stream have a different AI preferences policy express?
Where-
Along with
No,
Are you suggesting a quick-based attachment mechanism?
I'm trying, I'm not, let me be clear, I'm not trying to suggest, I'm trying to understand the scope of where we're drawing the line. I'm not proposing that we do this. I'm asking, like, in the most generic way possible. Is anybody talking about doing this? Are we talking about this? Are we simply saying we're not going to do that? I've not got a horse in this race.
Right.
And I want to understand where we're drawing the line.
So the proposal here is to attach it to a specific representation that HTTP provides to a client. That's it. Nothing more.
So in that
Not the
case,
resource, not the quick stream that it carries over, not the connection that it carries over. This specific representation has the following preferences attached to it.
And this is a well-understood concept in HTTP, where of a
I'm
representation.
not an HTTP guy.
Understood.
I'm a,
But it is the chunk of bytes that you send across.
as part of the connection transport.
No,
Connection is immaterial.
no, it's irrelevant. HTTP is built in such a way that you can put anything underneath of it.
Understood.
Now, if you want to talk about mock, then maybe we'll have a different discussion offline.
Sure. There are dragons now.
Media over quick, and if you want to talk to me about it, I'd be happy to.
I don't understand why this distinction they're merging. Why
So,
would it be different than quick itself?
So we've had this discussion previously about the different protocols that can carry things that might need to have preferences attached to them. Gary mentioned SMTP yesterday. With Ted's mind, mock is likely to be a way in which video media is going to be delivered to a lot of people. And so having an attachment mechanism for that might make sense.
So just like there's ENS over quick, media over quick is a different application that enables.
Yeah, I totally know media over quick is in the down the weeds level, but I'm trying to understand why media over quick would be different than quick itself.
So there are two different attachment methods that would be possible in media over quick. One would be like HTTP, where you could attach it to a specific stream of content as metadata in part of how it's delivering a particular type of video, for example. You could also deliver it for an entire session over a control stream. So you would have to define in a media over correct context, the syntax of saying that for the session, and at the content level for each content type that you're going to stream, how you would do it for that content type.
So when I take you to
It is really kind of down in the weeds.
and I'm asking the question just so I understand where the boundaries are, so I apologize if I'm driving some.
So, but the distinction here is that all the protocols we've mentioned as examples are application layer protocols that have a firm idea of the content and the application that is in use at the time. Whereas, for example, Quick, like TCP and like other generic protocols, are more fundamental infrastructure, transport, and other lower layer protocols. And so, I guess the analogy you would use is if I'm trying to regulate content on televisions, I probably want to do it up, or that sort of thing. I want to do it up in the layer where it's meaningful to talk about television broadcasts, not for electricity sockets, because electricity can be used for many things, just like Quick can be used for many things, and it doesn't really have a firm concept of content. And indeed, it doesn't have and I guess the confusion you saw was Quick doesn't have the concept of headers that are about the application layer. It just has transport concerns.
Individual quick sessions within the overall connection. Yes, so then getting back to the other question that is, which it sounds like we do need to discuss, is or the container does it have individual policies, expressions? The container elements, or we simply do it as a container model and be done with it.
So there's a question here, because we have in the IETF and elsewhere, composite media types, and this is actually a very thorny issue, especially in places like the W3C, where you're combining lots of things into a container that can be treated as if it's a piece of content. Dragons be there. I think there's some simple answers. If you're using multi-part MIME, for example, then there are some relatively straightforward answers there, but that's not used as much as it used to be. When we get into the linked relations discussion, this is one of the things that made me nervous, because linked relations can talk about a piece of content rather than the whole thing, and has the idea that I'm linking part of something to part of something, and so we have to think through the indications there.
And let me be clear, the reason I'm wasting everybody's time on this is it's not just abstract. It's that in the world of media delivery, streaming, we are now building very rich media environments that are combining content, audio, video, other things from multiple streams simultaneously. Sometimes in real time, sometimes we combine them and then deliver as a whole. Advertising, generic advertising being a really good example, right? And I'm trying to sort through as we talk about these things and the grammars and the other attachment mechanisms. I'm trying to explore the edge conditions of where there be dragons and where there may be opportunities. And so that's why I'm driving through.
So the only feedback I'll give you is maybe more efficient to do that out of session if we're going to go deep into it, because the time here is quite precious.
Sure. Yeah, I think if you can go to a higher level, right? If you can kind of agree on HTTP setting that we want to work on and leave the other things for discussion, like at some point, I think that could be a good start. Because
perhaps so.
I think there's disagreement on the other things, but I don't hear any disagreement on doing this for HTTP unless
No, it seems like I haven't heard any pushback.
Right. So I just want to put a dot on it and then
flag it, declare some victory.
Yeah. Put a pin on it. That is
Drag the queue before you call
Yeah.
victory.
Sorry?
Drag the queue before you declare victory.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. Sure.
This
You
is,
don't want to do HTTP?
No. This is a question maybe to Leonard, but there's a situation that I think of the attachment question, which is either like an ignorant or a bad faith actor repost some content on a new URL, a new server without the correct headers. What would be nice is a way for a good faith actor to ask look at some header and say, are you the actual rights holder? Because my understanding of the law, as it's probably going to come from the EU, is only the rights holder has the right to opt out. So a good question for a good faith actor to ask is, who is the rights holder for this content? Do I believe that the server that's giving me a header that says I am the rights holder is the real rights holder? Is this in scope for what we're doing here? Does T2BA solve this problem?
So this is where two things. So one, embedding. So this is why someone may want to embed in the actual content rather than putting it into the header.
But embeddings can be scraped off, right?
Sorry?
Embeddings can be scraped off.
Right. So
Okay.
I understood, right, but that, it's at least somewhat better than an HTTP header. It's not as good as other things, and this is where, for example, as Sebastian has mentioned in chat, the work he does in the on ISCC, which is a fingerprinting mechanism to generalize it. Because that would now enable you to take any arbitrary asset, fingerprint it, look up that fingerprint in a registry, and then retrieve either a complete content credential or just the AI preferences or whatever is stored in that registry. So there are mechanisms for all of these things that exist out there. The question is, at the end of the day, what are you looking to retrieve? And how complete do you want to be against bad actors? And how much is that your biggest concern?
Can I press forward then a good requirement for a winning MVP? As far as lots of rights holders are concerned, from my experience, is you don't have the answer to the question of diffusion and bad actors reposting stuff. It's an incomplete MVP, and it just will not get any pickup from people.
I think like one of the discussions we had is that like we don't determine the validity of somebody to make the assertion. I think that was something we had a quite long discussion on. Like who can make an assertion is not something we want to decide ourselves. Right, like so the question is like everybody states their preferences, like and somehow it will combine. But I don't think IETF can take a stand on like who has standing to make an assertion. At least that's my read of like all the
I think
discussions.
so. It's kind of implied by our charter, the way that it's written. It's not explicit, it's implied.
As in, anyone can make assertions, but can the proposal that we give a mechanism for like evaluating those assertions?
I think we can speak to the problems therein and outline that these things may happen and suggest some ways to address them. But I don't think we can provide technical mechanisms to say who can speak on the internet. Fine.
Thank you. Timid Robot?
I'm Timid Robot. So first to speak to you, Joe, I would say that in that kind of situation, I don't think it's reasonable to view whatever we produce as the complete solution. It would just be part of the solution. And that people who have those kind of needs are going to need additional tools to solve their problem.
Such as?
The fingerprinting, internal lists about which domains they trust, stuff like that. I do just really briefly want to go back to what Glenn was talking about. My understanding from that conversation was that focusing on HTTP headers would effectively be container level. Is that correct?
They would apply by default to anything in that response.
Yeah. Okay.
Which means either a piece of HTML or an image or a plain text file or some JSON.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure I understood correctly. Thank you.
I hesitate to mention, there's a caveat there. I think clearly when something like mask is in use, the outer HTTP headers clearly would not apply to the thing inside, for example. These tunneling use cases, it gets a little more disconnected.
We understand that the headers on the master tunnel, like the master tunnel as a
a tunnel.
encrypted
Yes.
tunnel thing.
Yes, exactly.
Would you put a preference header there? You don't
Right. It doesn't make sense to any of us because we understand how these protocols work. It may be that we have to explain it to other people.
You should just ignore whatever.
Thank you. Sonia?
It's just a question really, clearing that the container is part of the content in some protocols, perhaps many of them. How would you read the preferences if there's no TVM intention?
Can you restate that?
Yeah, if the container is considered part of the content and the intention is no TVM, how do you read the preference?
Well, you don't do data mining.
But how do you know not to?
Well,
I mean,
You can at least read the header.
well,
Header's not copyrightable, I think. So copyright law says
copyright,
copyright gets
well,
used again.
I thought this was outside of copyright law. But I'm just saying that there is going to be quite a few things that are going to be interrupted.
I think that there might be a location-based preference express that will let you not do it. So if you get like a robust text could tell you that not to do it, and then.
So you need to have a no TDM
I'm just saying it may be there.
outside of the content, outside of the container, before you can exploit a no TDM.
So you can always reach and access it, just like you cannot then store and process it.
Right. Just throw it away.
Throw it away.
So from,
Gary, you want to make it?
just answer this one. Like if you come from robots.txt perspective, there you are allowed to read the robots.txt even if it's disallowed.
Yeah.
So basically, you can access it, and then you see the disallow, and then you don't do anything with it. You know, as in, like, you respect the disallow, but first you process it.
Like, I guess there'll be other protocols or other ways of communicating the preference, like ISCC, where you actually need to analyze the content in order to create the searchal hash to then put
Exactly.
up on the database. I mean, there's going to be some
Like how-
element of TDM that you have to do
Right.
to respect.
I would also
Sorry, come on,
caution,
close it.
like, reading too much into the broad TDM definition. Like, I think reading a file and acting on instructions, I'd be dubious that that is contained within the definition of text and data mining, at least in legal, because that is in order to generate new information. And I think reading and acting on information in that probably doesn't mean that. I'm not a lawyer, but
It doesn't say that. I mean,
There's no copy.
Well,
Okay,
No production.
I think we're getting probably outside the scope of the authority of this working group. So
just to make the point that TDM is difficult.
point is made.
Okay. Paul, your turn.
I think to come back to sort of to some degree, like we had this paper that we published before this paper, where one of the insights, and I think that is an answer to a lot of the questions here, is that no single attachment mechanism alone will solve the larger issue. Right? Like we explicitly, I think in that paper we sort of coined this difference between location-based and asset-based, and we have like one of the insights that we had there, like any solution to this problem space that aims to be comprehensive needs to include both types of attachment mechanisms, because some of them don't make sense in certain things, and to some degree they will also fill holes that might result from the behavior that we've described. So like I think we need to think all the sort of like we think the mechanisms that we define here in this space always in conjunction with other ones which are not defined here, like the stuff that Bastian is working on, and I was working with CPA and other things, and we don't need to solve the entire problem space here.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. Glenn?
Yeah, as I'm putting all together, I'm having trouble understanding beyond simple resources. Like it's a simple static resource, like web page or a text document that I'm retrieving by a fixed URL, a URL. Because I came into this room a couple days ago expecting that we were also going to address things like composite streamed media, that is composed and rendered. Like an example would be Stadia. An example would be video services where you are combining ads along with maybe a movie and there's ads around the side of it, all of which have different potential policy sets that need to be expressed. The direction this is going, which is just, I'm going to have one expression for that whole thing that's going to be in HTTP headers, drives me to saying the only thing I'll get is I'll get the most basic no answer.
But that's not the case. That's not how HTTP works. When you're looking at something in a web browser and there are lots of images on the page, each one of those things is a separate HTTP request.
That is why I said composite. And I understand that is how today's web browser world works.
Mm-hmm.
However, in the streaming media space, we have people who are in their head end assembling the whole page with all the pieces, single rendering of a thing, sending that down the pipe, which is why I very carefully chose the word composited, and I apologize, I didn't clear what I meant by that.
Right.
When we have a composited resource, the way this discussion states me is that the policy that I'll attach at the HTTP level, which is that whole container of things, will sort of be the amalgamation of all the different pieces that go into it, which is probably going to drive me down to a very restrictive thing. We apply the rule of most restrictive wins. So the answer will be probably no in most cases for that scenario, as opposed to a more useful thing of, yes, you can use this content identified by this thing, but you can't do the ads that are embedded along with it. You can't do the other piece of content that's in with it. That's where I'm sorting out a little bit.
I think, well, Gary wanted to respond.
Gary, you want a quick
Right.
response to it?
Yeah.
Okay,
Like,
Go ahead.
Like I can relate something from like how we are, like Google processes videos. And we can process M3 U8 formats. So basically you have a container. And then you
Very
have
familiar with
Yeah.
media.
Yeah, but for like the other people, so basically you have a container, like a larger container, and then you have basically a playlist of different things that are going to come in, and then your browser is going to play those individual items. And then if we see a no index, for example, on the container, on the M3 U8, like in the headers, for example, not only in the headers, because the HTTP header, then we are going to process there. Like we are not going to descend into the playlist and like try to see like what happens with each of the playlist items.
Which means I don't have a way to say you can look at the video, but you can't look at the audio, or you can't look at the audio, but you can look at you know what I mean? Like I can't differentiate by media types or other elements.
But if there's no index, basically there's an index, implied index on the container, then we are going to start processing each individual item and then look for the no index on each individual item.
Right.
Which from your perspective, that would mean that, like for example, if in a playlist file in an M3 U8, you have the first three are videos that you want indexed, let's say. Then you would leave it blank, and then there's an ad following.
Again, that's not the compensated answer. But I think I would take it away that the answer for compensated delivery of media elements, which consists of all the pieces, and they're not sent out as individual fetches and requests or individual HTTP requests. They're sent out as one request for getting that compensated experience. Then we'll have a single expression containing the HTTP stuff that applies to all the stuff inside of it universally. Which is a fine answer. I'm not trying to say it's
that is a potential answer, but to be clear, we're defining some attachment mechanisms. I can imagine that maybe MUPS will go off, have a discussion about how this works in the various different streaming parts of the world, and come up with an answer for theirs and say, well, let's define another attachment mechanism that's specific to this and try to get people to pay attention to that. But I can't see us doing that work in this group at this point in time.
Which is a fair answer.
Okay.
Thank you. Pierce?
Hi, yeah. I guess I think it's probably come up with a few people, like in terms of the actual how we're going to have to decide how we then specify the access permissions or the actual what you're going to do with the content, say robot.txt level, and then whether you should sort of scan. So, for example, if you say yes, but you need to check the individual items type of answer, as opposed to you could just say yes and then go check every single thing in the subdirectory, and have to download it all to get the specific, say, CTPA marking or something. I think we need to clarify that as to what the procedure should be for bots, really, as to how they're supposed to deal with it. Whether, I guess no would probably hopefully mean that they wouldn't enter the directory, but a yes might mean that they enter it, but then are they obliged to check the HTTP headers from then on? I just think we need to put that in somehow.
Do you want to respond to that, Mark? Or I think the point, Pierce, is that might be different people doing this thing. It's not like, oh, look at this and look at that. There might be different people doing those like preferences, right? Like somebody who's putting robots or text may not be the same person putting the stuff in the media or the like HTTP header, like right? Like so, I think it's not, but it's like just we need to worry about the existence of all of them at some point.
Yeah, but it's how do you combine the two? One would assume that a lot of the time is being coordinated by the site owner. The site owner may want to sort of take the granularity down for particular items and have a larger sort of indicator at a higher level. So,
and we need also clear communication on what's the preference when we see two conflict. Let's say we find no index and index meta tags or HTTP header today. And so this is, we need to be clear on that.
This is the combination issue, which we will.
Yeah, combination of the value and combination of the.
Yeah, it's the two things, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think
so we
thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like HTTP header is, I think, as you said, Martin, a relatively simple case, although there's work to be done there and discussions to be had. The other obvious IETF controlled potential attachment case is attachment by location, which is, I know we've had a proposal for robots.txt from a few people. And then the other obvious thing we could do is something new, something separate from robots.txt. And I think maybe the discussion to have now is what are the trade-offs inherent therein. So we can kick that off. It's roughly 2:15. We'll take a short break, maybe in about 20 minutes or so, and continue after that. So any initial thoughts?
You'd like the queues.
Oh, we have lots of people.
You mean we will start on robots?
Yes.
I'm scared that we jump to
Launch.
To 50-minute discussion. And
Yes, but the discussion out there helps too.
Okay. So personally, I do believe that unfortunately today there is no opt-out or opt-in global to all bots, and we need to address that. So the challenge that we see is that all bots have to be listed. There is no ability to opt out globally, and I want really to address this problem. Mean that most, not in Disalo robot, not in Disalo crawling, in AI preferences, we see Google coming with Google Extended, we see ChatGPT bot, nobody like this really look at star, excellent. And the challenge of this is that you have new players on a daily basis that are coming. DeepSeek is one of them. Nobody heard of us. They were collecting the internet, looking at star, and bingo, DeepSeek. No, I need to block them. And this is not retro compatible. A lot of top publishers, including in the room, want the default to be no LLM training, no training AI. So this is, I do personally believe that we need to address it by placing some statement at star level to hide this AI preferences applying by default, that this is allow or disallow, and then still have the ability to specify by bot what you want to allow or disallow.
So I suspect you're not going to get much pushback on that requirement. I think that's a fairly well understood problem. I think the question is, do we express that by leveraging robots.txt, or do we create something separate?
But did you just say part of the problem is that the star is ignored? I mean, that's something we cannot control.
No, it's not ignored. This is, let's say DeepSeek. They were scanning the internet, and they were looking at star, I am allowed, okay, collect the content. And clearly some sites are adding user agent Google Extended disallow and other user agent disallow to disallow AI training on their content, but still want to provide search access to the content. So this is why star was allowed. And so the key problem is that all these sites want the default to be no AI training, no LLM training. So we need to find a way to express that. To the default on my content is I'm okay for search, I'm okay to start auto crawling, but I want to specify no AI training.
Right.
But I mean, that's just, I wouldn't get a separate category for search and review.
I think yes, but yeah.
So if I could, another way of expressing this is I think that right now robots.txt allows you to select by user agent and it lets you to select by location, but not by purpose. And we really need, once we have a vocabulary, that needs to be a selector as well, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Thank you. Let's go to the queue, Martin.
Yeah, so I think this is pretty straightforward at the very high level. I think that the people who we want to target are all looking at robots.txt anyway. They have to because it governs things like how much they can request at any given time, rate limiting, what resources are on the table, all those sorts of things. And there's various performance benefits that you get from having something like robots.txt saying this part of the website is off limits. Don't even bother getting all that stuff. And so having that combination of things, including the fact that it's very widely implemented and respected, means that it is exactly right. I agree with Fabrice. This is about setting out purposes rather than getting down to knowing every single user agent that exists in the world and being able to correctly divide them into groups that correspond with purposes, which is what has been up until this point how people have had to deal with robots.txt, which is terrible. And I think if we have this purpose, this usage preference expression, and we can attach it to one of the groups in robots.txt, we have done our job up to the point where we have to deal with the other problems. And I don't know if we need to talk about that in the first round of discussions, but I'm going to raise them anyway. There are no usage preferences on any content that exists today. And someone who obtains content that they may use at some later date will virtually guarantee that it doesn't have compatible preferences associated with it. We're going to have to deal with that problem.
Put a pin in that. We'll get there.
We talked about that at lunch, and I think
it's
tractable, but I think we need to talk about it.
It's very tractable. So just to pause for a second. Fabrice, I interpret what you said as you support sorry, gentlemen, using robots.txt.
Yes.
As long as we can accommodate purpose-based selection in it.
Yes.
Okay. And Martin, you agree with that? Is that how I interpret what you said? That you would like to start with robots.txt as long as we can accommodate purpose-based selection?
Yeah, I think that's the only sensible strategy out of this, and I think it would mean less reliance on user agent, which is a secondary goal.
Okay, so if we can kind of structure the discussion around that question of do you support reusing robots.txt as long as we can meet that goal, that would be helpful to move us forward.
Okay.
So I think the answer to leverage robots.txt is a definite yes for me for many reasons that Martin laid out. However, I think that there are two different ways to leverage it, and we should consider both. One way to leverage it is to include the purpose-based things directly inside robots.txt, and the second is to make a relatively minor adjustment to robots.txt to have a pointer to a purpose-based .txt that's separate from robots.txt. And I think the trade-off there is the one that Martin was pointing out, is if you're going to take certain parts of your URI space and rule them out, you want to be able to do that in one place rather than two. And that points to me to say we should keep with the presumption we're going to do it in an updated version of robots.txt until we find a place where there's a breaking syntax issue that we can't resolve without putting it into this other file with this other syntax is now something you need to look at as well. That concentrates the complexity, but I think one of the things we want to do is to make sure that everybody that's currently looking at it for search keeps looking at robots.txt. And I think that means updating robots.txt for the location-based attachment is probably the best strategy, but there is an alternate strategy if we run into a real roadblock in the way syntax is currently used in the internet and the way the purpose-based syntax has to work.
But I hear you saying we should just keep that in our pocket for now.
I think we keep that in our pocket for now for the reasons that Martin raised, that what robots.txt will have to be parsed to do if you do this pointer is the parts of the URI space that you're just ruling out and the limits on how often you call, et cetera, that are in there now.
Eric?
Yeah, robots.txt with the same caveat that Martin said, not Martin, already said. Basically, have purpose. I actually disagree on not having or relying less on user agents. Like, we still need user agents in the robots.txt because there will be user agents that people will want on their side, and you need to be able to craft exceptions for them. If nothing else, then that. And
I'm not suggesting that we
but
unwind that feature. I think we just need less reliance on it. That's all.
okay, what I'm trying to tell you that I'm going to die on this hill that we need user agents pretty much forever in robots.txt because there's so many players on the internet, crawlers on the internet, and even more agents in the near-term future that you will need to be able to adjust controls and preferences for these clients.
Yeah, it's basically repeating what everybody says.
Sorry, can you speak up?
It's basically repeating what everybody says. Yes, robots.txt. Yes, with the sort of like terms defined in the vocabulary as categories in there. I think that's like some people have talked about the MVP before. Like, I think those two things, the vocabulary and the ability to express that in robots.txt, is the MVP that we need by August.
Timid Robot?
I'm Timid Robot. Yes to robots.txt. I also will later advocate that it be referenced multiple times. And I think that reducing the number of URLs that crawlers have to hit has a good amount of value. And then I also have a question. So robots.txt is an existing RFC. Is there another work group that currently owns it? So, okay. Thank you.
Colin?
Maybe to robots.txt, and I would say making this choice seems contingent upon the schema of which the vocabulary is expressed in, which I think you've called out. Shoehorning it into robots could be a problem, depending on how that's formatted. I think this also comes back to the question of timing too. Like, if that's something that we're thinking about integrating, which I can see being an important aspect for model trainers to know, sort of when the preferences were expressed. Also, just given the misconfiguration of robots.txt files, sort of like expanding the schema. Again, I find myself in a weird place, sort of infantilizing the user, which I certainly don't want to take that position. But nonetheless, we see a lot of robots.txt misconfigured. And I've heard this expressed by many companies that are crawling the web pretty frequently. Does this further entrench the problem of users who are trying to? I think we have to kind of think about the people who are configuring this, potentially misconfiguring this and causing more problems that are invisible to them. It's a consideration. whereas sort of breaking this out into separate file, even if it's in a pointer, and I actually like the idea of there being a pointer to a separate file to maybe avoid some of these misconfiguration, or at least like separate out some of the misconfiguration issues. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's basically it. So I just like think maybe syntax constraints may not make it the best fit. That's contingent on how the vocabulary ends up being expressed. Yeah, the potential sort of timing issues with referencing that, and sort of whether or not we're going to use some sort of pointer. Yeah, I'd say those are my big sort of hangups.
May I quickly reply?
Let's go to the queue.
Okay.
Joe?
I'm kind of agnostic as to whether or not it goes on robots or not. I think if people have got misconfigured robot, then that's probably a job for people to make tools to be on the scope of their work. But tools for helping people identify what's misconfigured and why would be really, really helpful. And people who know how these tools work really, really well should get involved in building those tools. If you're going to have a link to, if you're going to be like robots, by the way, here are my AI preferences. And the standard that we write maybe does say that's how AI preferences, then I don't see why you don't just have AI.text and say, well, just go straight to AI.text. Like, if what I want to know is someone's AI preferences, it seems a kind of wasted entropy to have to download and read the whole of the robots.txt. I'll need to go to a link at the bottom that I knew was in the video all along. So just have it in a separate file. But maybe there's a nuance here that I don't appreciate. On the whole, do we need to have user agent identification thing? I think the big drawback of robots.txt is that I can't say what I want to ban all user agents for, because there's no expression for intention of cause.
Yeah,
I think that's kind of what he said.
Precisely. So when I echo that, absolutely, you need to be able to say, no one's allowed to have this for X, apart from these bots that I trust. Okay. And absolutely, that's going to be a requirement of the final standard.
Thank you. Pierce?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think, yeah, robots.txt seems like a good option. Although, yeah, I think the referencing another one might then lead to the problem mentioned where you just have to go get another one. So in a way, it'd be nice if we could tie it in. The other thing was around the tying it into user agents. Like with the user agent is sort of being deprecated on some platforms, and there are things like sort of client hints. I was just wondering, we'd considered about how this might interact with the uses of robot.txt and user agents, because they are becoming a bit less useful, let's say, for some things. And I wonder, I guess at the moment people do advertise them, but I suppose it's more client side, isn't it, really, than server side. So in that sense, it's maybe less of an issue.
It's not an issue in this case. The actions that browsers take don't really apply here. Browsers are doing that work.
Yeah.
It's only browsers. These are the robots we're talking about.
Right. Yeah, it's true. So I guess it's probably less of a consideration. Okay.
Thank you. Miriam?
Yeah, I think we should use robots.txt. It's widely deployed, and it has many problems. It's not really a modern protocol, but just implementing yet another protocol will not necessarily solve that problem. So let's start from where we are. I think I don't care if you have maybe like having a separate file. I think the only case where a separate file might be useful if there's a use case where you really want to just get one of those files and you don't want to get both. If you really always want to get both, then like you just have two HTTP requests instead of one, and it's not. So kind of that's, if there are use cases where one part of the information is useful and not the other one, then maybe you can think about two files, but I don't really care about this. What I do care about is that originally the robots.txt was really about access. It's like if you even try to retrieve the file, or if you try not overloading the system, right? So that was about accessing the file. While now it's kind of more defining what happens after you have the file, which might be like you shouldn't have it at all, or it might be you have it and you might use it for something but not for something else. So that's very different, and I think we need to keep those things a little bit separate because we shouldn't break the things we have about access already in there, like how often you can call and whatever. That's still important. We shouldn't mix that up.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, so just speaking individually, when we started this work way back when, I had a lot of reservations about robots, and I was assuming we'd have a different file, and that's because robots.txt is horrible. And that's no reflection on the fine work that Gary and friends did. It's because it's an old thing. It's a relic of a different age. But I talked to Gary a lot about the ecosystem and about the work they did, and I became convinced that it was extensible enough to serve this purpose. And more importantly, that the implementations are sufficiently aligned and that it can actually be interoperably extended. And I think that for me was the bar. So I became comfortable with using robots.txt for all the reasons that people have been talking about, to the point that we may find issues down the road. Yes, of course, that's how we do things. If we find the issues, we'll deal with them then, and we may change our minds and say, oh, wait, we really can't do this in the confines of robots.txt, and that's why we keep things in our back pocket, as Ted mentioned. But I think Miria raises an excellent point that discontinuity of purpose is something we're going to need to continually keep in mind to make sure we understand all the implications of how robots.txt is written, and indeed probably go through that spec line by line and make sure that we understand its implications for our work. And perhaps our work may even have to update that RFC, and we should keep that in mind.
Gary?
So robots.txt, the syntax is so dumb, like that exactly that makes it super extensible. Because it's just two, basically it's a key value pair, and you keep adding. And if the parser doesn't recognize something, then it skips it and doesn't do anything with that particular thing. So for example, to your example, like if someone makes a mistake with the AI preferences or our thing that we come up with, like the TDM yes, search no that Martin is proposing, for example, like if that has a typo, then the parsers will just skip over that. Like that's how they are instructed to deal with it. So I really like robots.txt because it's so dumb.
But on the user side, it's so easy to make a typo, right? And not achieve like one. I think that's the problem. But I think this is something we should keep in mind.
Yeah.
We have to like redefine the protocol.
Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah.
My point is that like if you make a typo, you are not going to mock up anything. Like it's just like
you
are
mock up your
like it's just like
Let's stick to Q.
Okay. But how robots.txt operate in an environment where activity on the web becomes automatic, where it's not just about websites and crawlers, but about agents and websites. And at that level of interaction now, some of those activities may go beyond some of the AI-related issues that we're talking about today, and there may be others that we don't know about yet. But in terms of that web automation level, and I asked because a colleague of mine has been working on an internet draft that I think is still in process that you guys will see soon that attempts to define some sort of activity.
I think defining that is a very, very good idea. And like yesterday, Martin said something like, would a browser would be an agent if it's performing something for the user. And I don't know what the answer is. I would say no, but then curl supports robots.txt, so.
But curl is a different thing, right?
What is it though?
But it's not, and it is.
Do you remember links?
Yeah, I've used it many times.
So it seems like we should be thinking about an application for that environment too. So that is definitely a world beyond robots.txt. And so it's not
It's
Potentially. I don't know if it is. But that's something that we have to define, and something that, like, at least on our side, thinking a lot about.
One of the things that we should keep in mind is we have the ability, if we choose to define that different attachment mechanisms are appropriate for different applications. So if you're training an AI model, you should look at these places. If you're doing agentic AI from a desktop machine or whatever, or from a phone, you should look at these attachment mechanisms.
My name is Tim Agrova, and I'm looking forward to us defining what is and isn't a robot within the context of robots.txt.
Don't worry, the revolution is coming, my friend. Robots will rise up.
It's just that we want to agree to what is said in the room.
Sorry, folks?
Yeah, I think I agree with what you said, and we are at risk of breaking the internet if all the application AI agent browsers are starting to look at robots text file on the websites. Right now there is, we are caching every 8 hours, I think 12 hours for you the robots text file. So this is really limited number of HTTP requests on the robots text file. We may end up with having millions of HTTP requests on the robots text file if all the application. So relative to what Matt said, yes, I user agent specific. If you load the content, the page, maybe we just look at the HTTP header, maybe good enough. Again, something to think about. I don't have a complete solution. Okay.
Sebastian?
Yes, so just one comment, and to be clear that I'm not speaking against robots.txt or anything. I think it's a good first method to support and to use, but we have to be aware of the sentiment among the people who are addressed by this vocabulary. So very clearly, robots.txt is not supported by creators and rights holders. And actually, there's a massive opposition against it because it doesn't work for creators like photographers or stock photo companies or record labels or book publishers. For them, it doesn't have any meaning and any relevance. So what I'm proposing, like to be, is that the vocabulary which we will be defining has to be agnostic to the channels that are used to communicate the preferences, and just to keep that in the background, in the back of our head, that everything that the vocabulary defines should and must be applicable to methods that are actually supported by the creative communities. I think that's very important to make that kind of mental, have that mental disposition, right?
I don't think like we think of anything else, right? I think that's really the intent as well.
I think that's why we agree. Thank you. So is that trained the queue?
Yeah, it's done.
Okay, lovely. So it seems like we have strong support for starting with robots.txt for location-based attachment, which is good. One of the things I didn't mention as chair, there's in the RTF alone experience that creating a new format is an attractive nuisance, and we would probably not meet our schedule and may not finish for several years if we started to create a new format. So I think that's probably the right place to end up. But we'll see how we go. And as we said, we hit a roadblock. If it becomes clear that it's not viable, we can consider other approaches.
It does mean we're, potentially having to update the current RFC.
That may be one implication of the work, yes. It may be that we can define an extension that does not change anything in the existing or change the interpretation of anything in the existing RFC. But that is certainly on the table, and that from a process standpoint, that's one line in the file, basically, and then lots of reviews.
Quick comment?
We have more question about process, so I understand the vocabulary that's sort of text-based work based on draft. I anticipate it. Where does this happen?
Where does this start from? Yes. So we have a number of drafts that have been proposed. We can certainly talk through those. It's a convenient time to take a break, so maybe we can talk about that after we come back. So it's 2:45. Why don't we come back at 3? Make sense? That's good. As a reward for agreeing to something?
This is like Pavlovian. It's like, oh, you finished early. Why don't you get a coffee? Hey, Mark.
Gary, this is a very there was a creation didn't realize
Yeah, I gotta stop.
Right, like, so I think, this is how.
You can't look at that. Yeah.
Like, so I think that's kind of what.
Yeah, and essentially, like, I mean, that's the point where that goes wrong.
Sorry, I'm not.
Yeah, and that's it. Well, again,
This is all you need. Really?
For some reason, I don't think
You're evil. Actually, interesting.
First, every single access.
Oh, well,
I agree that it's different.
Yeah.
Oh, it doesn't, it froze. So there's two characters that are lingering somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's tricks. Or I think it's psychologically.
I don't want to format to use, like the markdown or XML.
Oh, yeah, you can do it.
Yes, it's a need process.
Okay. You also smart. But they don't, or you just have no need at all because no need content exists because it's a script. Treat you with the respect according, so, which I think the solution. Also, it's not a meditation with biometrics and treating
By the way, there are
fine,
some
so we
work
just
to
do that. Probably have.
we have friends of ours who use the treats that are.
Understand your comments.
So
It takes your modern, but reinventing it is problematic. And then you were talking about, so robot subtext is about access to the file. Yes, actually,
Silly.
And we are,
Make sure
video.
you what are issues, which are not really about accessing and what can be done after accessing and why.
And a lot more energy, a lot more energy.
The agentic web is like, overlooking that in this session, I think would be like.
It's okay. I think we're just very.
I'm not saying everything's perfect. I'm saying
And on the heels of people making it, and on the heels.
So, also, there's no spell check here, and it's
Many watermarks.
There's a lot of
So I'm also
technology
gonna just
is
first
more
have.
basically saying it out.
Yeah, so I don't know how to.
I guess the question is how.
If your goal is to
Certainly the bug camp, it's coming up.
motivate and it's not the problem.
I will say this, we, in my space, extremely motivated and well resourced and necessary, and we have robust online skills.
Maybe
But-
That has space attack and successful.
Yeah,
What's the automated?
Now it's good, Marty is helping me.
I was trying, but I can't do all the things at once.
Yeah.
So my position on this is that we should not ask for this period.
Is to define.
Like we should hire
So
hire a note taker for.
So,
No, but
AI transcription of what people are saying is not necessarily. If you want textual forms,
Instructions
people can watch the videos. And the most important thing to do out of any of these discussions
For that. Well, yes, I
are
mean,
decisions
the
that are made.
idea.
So am I saying it's not
I mean, you hit the.
Well, but that would require,
Out of the.
No, that's what I'm saying.
but that's not a decision that was made, that was
And.
fodder for an email to be sent.
Sure, of course.
Right.
But there's an action on taken there, which is about the chairman and funding this and recording the action.
That's basically how we, I mean, right now we use.
There's an issue that was raised in the issue.
The syntax.
I think I would rather that they hire a note taker.
Basically anticipating that this is.
Yeah.
I don't know, we have
So they
better
also
routing
kind of
instructions,
decided that the
wallet
something
addresses, all of these sort of things.
Yeah.
I don't think, I mean,
You never
robots
know
is
which
way
points to
overloaded
actually
already, you know.
Yeah, but that's
I mean,
what.
I understand why this is.
Yeah, but that's kind of usually then people, if you have a question, or like if you want to kind of go rather
Feels like
space balance and you want to
the
record it and
perfect
then write it in but the time.
We would need better recordings. Right, because, because like if you look at that, anyone not in view, you have to recognize the
Maybe
voice,
this is just.
or you have to rely on
maybe
them
this
to
is
actually
just-
say their
I don't
name.
worry about this as much, but.
But I mean, no, yeah, it would be nice to have.
Yeah, sure, I guess it's actually, that's why.
But you chose the name, right, so like.
Well, that is included in the recording. So my problem is that what we do when we ask.
I think this one is quite a nice argument
If
for,
we effectively take that.
we spoke about buckets yesterday.
Yeah.
And maybe you can take Glenn's suggestion, and say, don't put yellow, two buckets, the generative AI training, and generative AI. Search is only robots, we robots.
I would like.
I don't want you to screen me for like, to get the grading percent specific generative products. But if you're gonna do like spam filters, whatever, that's totally fine, like, okay, I'm gonna do these things. And if you're gonna be using agents to either do summaries from news, to get the top FT, or which was, we're gonna destroy the e-commerce side, we're gonna do anything else.
You don't always have slave labor.
And I feel like the kind of things that consumers quite a lot of care about, being broadly broken into.
That's
So they
why
are agents. And agents include
have a bad
the
transcription.
news media problem, but it also includes all problems that will appear with the things that you take to them.
Fast conversation because.
Yeah, I mean,
I
that's
just find it
like,
unhelpful
you
because
always
then
have
people
to
care
manage
about the
people who are not
retraining.
like deeply engaged, but
I-
then
well,
it makes it.
Exactly.
It depends on what.
Everyone here is here because they have something valuable to bring to you, and by taking it out, that's doing them as a service.
But
And
it's
it's
also
also,
the only
we're not very good
role,
at typing.
or even sections of agents in general, is that they can go and fetch some stuff.
We're not professional transcriptionists. You know.
And we get distracted by our own opinions.
Well, there have been a number of meetings where I've been described, and I describe things.
But I want humans to be able to summarize.
I wanted
So,
to.
I want to protect the drop boxes.
I am having difficulty describing this because it is so offensive.
People use tools to understand information. What we
Can't
can't
do
do
the IETF.
is like quite a lot of humanized thing. Humanized thing is what means that like
It's
it's
not
not
like-
to be reasonable and manageable, and also guarantees that like.
Mhm.
So
Personal
that's what Chris humanness meant.
That sort of thing, but
Because
sort of
if you
fundamentally, technically,
just bad facts.
Just very bad opinions, like.
You want to summarize the news reality. You talk about a news site not on the table, you talk about a news site that's just available.
Was being used to justify, very bad.
It's just for.
Very bad effects on.
Advertisers are not going to pay for any.
So any one very and just beautifully type down what the correct. Yeah.
Interaction.
WQC is worse than this.
There is a question.
Yeah, why?
Because they refuse to record with.
You have to figure out what that means.
Some groups have managed to sort of get an agreement from everyone in the room that recording is acceptable. So that's the only terms under which I will record a session. And so most sessions are not recorded, and the only thing that you have is effectively the amateur transcription.
And that's exactly what it's for.
But then what's the
They follow California, recording guidelines, which basically says that you need to get consent from all parties involved.
But then there's no human language in the act system, and then the act forum, app provider's not going to pay you.
And we do have.
So I think I think we're agreeing.
But I understood the why are there worse opinions?
I
think
Yes. New York Times has references in but then maybe legislatively wherever these things.
So this group is so much public institutions.
I understand why we have to.
Lawyers in the room.
But then that's enough.
Which is correct. But most of the IETF discussion
But it's surprisingly new.
very high focus about what gets to put somewhere with something which is just not something because we can prove decisions and facts. Discussions whether or not it's indistinguishable and that's just
It seems to be like some old problems on the classes.
It is, but it's
obviously. Basically, like these actors.
Exactly.
I think that what
I think because the higher you get the stack, the more you get exposed to the
But then I think you have to say, because
the more you get
the effect on single program. The solution to me is obviously to say, well, you have to authenticate yourself. Because once you can authenticate yourself, I can then recommend you. And I can also control the number of people who choose to get signed up.
Yeah, but that's rewriting this entire way. Right.
No, it's the thing that says, like, you have to authenticate to get access to this. And then you can roll over. Well, then you can go to relying on distinguishing humans on browsers and agents. Why you use a huge focus on something called human environments.
And here we got something. Another camera there. Well, then the presidential there, then you don't have certain things from the
It doesn't diminish
the.
What you say, this is my agent and it's blessed and it's only for me. And you can be sure that I have no other agents to live.
I'm just glad that my
monitor is the newspaper account for people, whereas I'll pay the access to send it.
would be bad.
Whereas
Just,
agents.
it makes me feel like someone's like.
Over your shoulder, yeah, totally.
And you can either do it for proving humanness or by somehow attaching some conversion to the agent. But I think that unless you have like to get really, really good at spotting bad faith agents or good at written or whatever it is, the good needs something. Okay, I'm very comfortable. I'll be back.
What time do we say we're restarting?
Yeah. Oh, all right, we're late.
That's off all the world problems.
Then we can only sit in so many of these working groups.
Until we have no people left. We will have problems. But
I think, but yeah, nonetheless, it's cool to hear that people are working.
I mean, it's.
Yeah.
My understanding is, I think that was an expressed goal, like certain entities. Yeah. Well, certainly all of us.
I see.
I'm very
As long as it's
Your interpretation of it as it applies to AI.
I mean, it's good. It's also it's more of a transition.
Okay, I agree.
So many people now to bootstrap the robots.
Correct.
And then we have to do away with
Skype to be retired.
Yeah, what's up with that software?
I actually like Skype. When I'm traveling, it's the only way I can call a real phone. Can I call a real phone number from Teams? Teams. Okay.
Why?
Okay. Are we back? Remote folks, can you hear us? Are you still there? Oh, wait, I muted, didn't I? Did I? No, I didn't. Do we have anyone remote?
Yeah, a lot of people come on.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Fantastic. Hello, welcome back.
I think we need another minute taker.
We do, especially since our minute taker disappeared.
What? I'm here.
Oh, no, that's right, it was you. I'm so sorry. Did not mean to negate you.
I will continue.
You will continue?
Martin is helping me. But I'm telling you, you have to go and have a look, the quality is pretty efficient.
We're accustomed to a variety of levels of quality. So.
Okay, right.
This is actually very good. This is good. If Ted says it good, you should take that home. That's a good compliment.
But and also speak a little bit slowly, and if I want to give an opinion about it, give me the phone.
Sure. And if you need someone to clarify or remember what their name is, just please interject.
Yeah, okay. So what's the title of this session?
We're still just on attachment for now.
Yeah, but you said you were going to talk about something specific right before we left.
Well, we're going to talk about which document to adopt right now. So your chairs had a quick discussion during the break, and we're aware that there are a number of different proposed drafts in this space for attachment, especially by robots.txt, and a lot of drafts that touch upon it. So rather than having a popularity contest for those drafts and spending that time, what we thought would be more appropriate would be for us to appoint some editors, ask them to survey that landscape, make a concrete, compact, succinct proposal that addresses the requirement and takes into account the discussion we've had today, bring that to the working group, acknowledging where they've taken ideas from other drafts as appropriate, of course, and bring that to the group, and we can issue a call for adoption and get some consensus to use that as the starting point. Does that make sense to everyone?
Specifically for enhancements to robots.txt.
For attachment via robots.txt.
Robots.txt.
Exactly. Yeah. Not the HTTP header yet. I think we'll treat that separately.
I was just going to ask that question.
And it may be that we do that as an addendum to that document. It may be that we do it as a separate document. But let's just do the minimal start and then go from there. See Martin making faces.
I'll make faces for him.
We have to get this done by August. And
Yes.
That's what I'm.
You think take a shortcut?
I think we need to take a shortcut. Can we do them both together?
I think that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm also. Elena is making faces. Can you define this?
So I think we need a draft. Mark was talking about was a draft that did specifically just attachment for robots.txt. I'm suggesting we do attachment, all of the ones that we can within the IETF, which is robots.txt and HTTP header, draw the line there.
And if it is just those two, I think that's appropriate. If we find that there are other things that need to be written, we can talk about how we split up the documents later down the road. And it may be that we come to a place where we say, oh, you know what, these are better as two documents, but if we think that we want to do them together as a start, I think that's fine.
I have no idea from experience with the speed of IETF, but I think like if you have vocabulary plus at least one attachment mechanism, that's probably the like for always. So like for you to judge if this is unrealistic amounts of stuff.
I think IETF is not known for speed. I think that's probably the reason that like Martin is trying to like put this together.
Yeah, if we were going to do two documents and say we're going to do that same process with two documents, that would be fine. It's just more overhead.
Sure. Yeah, but the only thing, the reason I would look to two documents is one document for vocab and the vocab / abstract data model / default serialization.
Yes.
A, and then B is the attachment.
That's what we're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Because I wasn't clear. It wasn't clear.
Right, sure.
Then I'm,
we talked about
I think the first,
pause for the first and this, yeah, great one.
like a new document, like from scratch.
Yes.
Right.
So in document B, I'm to my robot. In document B, I think that there's value in doing both robots and headers because I've seen many times where we make assumptions about how we view the vocabulary with it, like it's purely based in robots.txt. And I think having that second unit-based attachment will help kind of inform the way that we do it in a way that doesn't cause premature optimizations and dead ends.
Get it?
General question. Since we have momentum and we have interested parties in other protocols, like email protocols. Wait, I have to keep a straight face. And we have email-related people who are interested in working on those areas. Would it be stupid to write up a draft that addresses, for example, SMTP, or tries to address SMTP?
No.
I think people can write whatever they want, like
Right.
we won't consider it.
If you want to spend some time, or you know someone who wants to spend some time doing that and then circulating that, that's fine. Would it be stupid for this group to adopt such a draft right now? Yes. Personally, yes.
It's just like I know someone who would want to work on that.
Fit. And the nice thing about that is if we have kind of these, unofficial attachments, they can exercise the model that we're creating to make sure that it makes sense in different contexts.
Yeah.
I think that's quite healthy.
And someone should write a mock one, for instance.
Sure, someone should.
And kick the tires a little bit, make sure this whole just an idea. What is your SDP?
So are you guys suggesting drawing a line on basically what's already submitted thus far in terms of like how that will be considered for the August deadline? Is that what you're saying? I mean, the internet draft that I was referencing my early intervention is, should be coming through today. It would be great if, not that it necessarily needs to be incorporated in what we deliver in August, but just, to make sure that we're not artificially saying, well, it's not, if it's not up yet, then it's not going to be part of what we're doing.
Oh, not at all. No, we fully expect potentially many more drafts to be submitted to the attention of the group.
Right.
It's just right now we need to adopt starting points for our work.
Sure.
And we're identifying those, and then so other drafts will feed in to those, and we may take those, and again, acknowledging those appropriately in the document as ideas or proposals to, how to address certain issues or problems that we want to address. Those are not our only deliverables, but they are the biggest, chunkiest ones right now. The other one is the combination. We've also had a couple of discussions about this kind of guidance document for people who want to create policy or other things based upon this framework. And we'll get to those things.
Yeah, and I fully expect somebody to submit a draft on July 28th, like after the IETF as well.
Sure.
And it's probably gonna happen.
So you mentioned combination. I think that's a problem for Paul's draft to address, because we have an abstract thing. We should talk about how to take that abstract thing, 2 copies of that abstract thing, and turn it into 1 copy of that abstract thing.
That's where I'm leaning as well. Is it, you could think about putting that in a separate document, but it seems to live there most naturally.
Yeah. I think it's not done until we have that.
Now, it may be that we have a discussion about combination, and then people go away and write drafts, and we say, oh, wait, that's the way to do it. Incorporate that draft into.
Right, and that may be the right way to deal with it.
Right. I would like to see well-formed proposals. That helps us a lot more than, casual discussions.
This may be enough. This may be small enough that an email works.
Perhaps.
But it would have to be a nice, crisp, clean email.
Exactly.
We have a slide deck from Yari that addresses that question as well.
He's in a call.
Put it in the chat. Earlier.
I have the. Do you want me to share it? But yeah, I wanted to be there.
Yeah, let's put a pin in that for the time being.
That level of detail is probably all we need for something like that. But I would simply start with open an issue to track this particular problem.
Yeah.
Collect pointers to the various proposals in that issue, and then we can have a discussion about which one we think.
Exactly. So as we talked today, then I kept a kind of a laundry list of the issues that came up regarding attachment, and I think this can form the start of an issues list related to attachment. And what I had was the time applied when the attachment, the preferences discovered via attachment are discovered when they're applied to the when they're applicable to the content. So especially with robots.txt, there's been a discussion of, if I'm training a model right now and I have content that I got 3 years ago, do I use the robots.txt I got 3 years ago? Do I use a robots.txt that I fetch now, or something else where it might be some protocol feature that disambiguates that? That's an area of activity we need to discuss, I think. We talked about the HTTP header, so that's a feature. We talked about link relations, which we don't have a solid proposal for right now, but I think proposals are welcome. We had the whole nexus of what attachment mechanisms do you look at to determine what the applicable preferences are in any given situation. And a subset of that is it might be that we decide that for certain applications or certain areas of interest, you look at a specified subset of the known attachment mechanisms because they're more appropriate for that use case. So that's an area of discussion. And where that kind of instruction lives, I guess, is an interesting question as well. Is that a separate document? Is that in the core document? Is that in a registry? So forth and so on. That's a whole discussion to have. This whole notion of containers, I think, is a nascent discussion of, when I have encapsulated media and multi-part media, how does that work? And then specific to robots.txt, there's all the issues that flow from that. I think we'll get into that as we.
I think it's like 1 file, 2 file is like the biggest thing.
Yeah, well, I think it's one file right now until we discover otherwise. Yeah.
No, but just as an issue that I've brought up, right? Like, should we do a level of indirection or not?
I think we determined that. I think we don't do indirection unless we have to. Yeah.
Oh, in robots.
In robots, yeah. Are there any other kind of high-level issues that we want to get on the list for attachment? I'm sure there are.
Are we taking a position? Do we want to take a position on the embedded scenario? Should we leave that open for look to see what proposals are sent forward? And basically, we don't have a position yet until somebody puts one forward.
Well, so our charter is structured that for specific formats, for embedding specific formats, that the venue that owns that format should do that. And so we have to liaise with them in some fashion to create that. And I think part of the problem we have is we don't really have something to point them at yet to say, hey, we think you should be looking at this. So hopefully that'll resolve pretty quickly. If you know, I know you've got interest there, obviously, if you want to start, working on a proposal there.
That's what I'm,
By all-
that's
by all
what I
means.
say that if that would be, yes,
Yeah.
I'm happy to put forth the proposal,
Right.
if that's appropriate.
Just understand probably, maybe adoption would lag a little bit, until we firm up, what that document looks like, yeah. I'll put that on the list just so we don't forget, because that is gonna require some coordination, since, most of these formats are around in other places. And even like for HTML, we have to talk to that community.
So we haven't done each of these.
Sorry? We'll voice it on. Yeah, we know which arms to twist, yeah.
Yeah, no, they don't have a choice.
Yeah.
It's the meta tag.
Anything else?
I'm not sure if you mentioned that just now. You mentioned this sort of like registry of attachment mechanisms.
Yes.
Is that on the, did you mention
That was in the kind of, I should probably create a separate bullet point for this. For the idea of how does one determine what the authoritative, it is here actually. How do you determine what the authoritative attachment mechanisms are for a given scenario? And one of the ways that one could address that is to create an IANA registry that lists the attachment mechanisms. And so then you have a way to reference that effectively.
Is that in scope for us? Is that-
We could.
No,
No,
thanks.
No, it's not right.
A registry of the solid attachment mechanisms.
Yes.
A registry called the actual designation.
No, of the actual mechanism.
Of mechanisms. So robots.txt, HTTP header, in JPEG files using this mechanism, so forth and so on.
And it would have a hierarchy of which one to obey.
No, I think that's the combination problem, or
But what would you use the registry for?
to make it discoverable. The other alternative would be that we bake into perhaps the course spec a list of attachment mechanisms.
Well, into the attachment, then. So if we're doing two documents, it would be which the second one being attachment. In the attachment document, you would discuss, here are some attachment documents.
And maybe here's some other ones. Yeah, that'd be another way
And
to do
here's
it.
some other ones and things like that. I mean, that's.
Right. And the other
That's what I've been envisioning.
right. And the other alternative. Sorry, just one second. The other alternative is we don't do this, and it's up to the legal context to decide what you pay attention to.
Well, so they're two different things. There's.
Paul was going to.
Yeah, you're pointing to the source of my unease, sort of like this is sort of self-assigning ourselves a responsibility that others might also have. And to some degree, the idea of like, I think the original idea of the vocabulary was sort of more separate from attachment mechanisms in that sense that any entity developing what we call an attachment mechanism could say like, the thing I've developed complies with RFC, whatever that ends up being. Right, like that, so there isn't, whoever maintains that registry has the power to exclude from that registry. And I think that could be somewhat problematic in some settings.
I think the idea of having a registry is like somebody actually says like, I read your document about the vocabulary and I'm using this attachment mechanism in the same way that you need it. I think that's the value of that thing, saying like, hey, like there's somebody who read this and register into it saying that I'm using it in the same meaning.
Okay, I think
So if you don't have
I
it-
see the value of this, like maybe separate from others. Maybe I just don't know enough what you mean when you say. that.
True, and registries have many different freighted meanings. In the IETF, when we establish a registry, there's a registry policy, and that can be anything from first come, first served. Anybody who makes a proposal gets into it as long as it isn't already, the name they choose isn't already occupied, or all the way to IETF consensus, where it has to go through the full IETF process and have an RFC issued to get into the registry. And we would have to choose the appropriate policy to get for that. I think the underlying problem we're talking about addressing here is that if this isn't done anywhere, then there is a lot of doubt in content producers' minds about what they do to their content, what will be listened to and what will be ignored, because it's now at the discretion of the AI actors as to what they pay attention to.
I fully understand the purpose of this and why it's necessary, and I think it's an essential part of a solution. I just don't fully grasp what it means if this would be something that is proposed by this group or set up by this group versus there's other scenarios.
So the typical idea is like when the attachment or document or the vocabulary document goes to become an RFC, it can have a consideration. It says like, I'm going to create a registry for like this attachment things, right? So it's like the group proposing it, but it's an action that follows with a document getting published at some point.
And what I suspect might be an interesting way to go would be for if we establish a registry that's relatively low bar to get into, first come, first served, or something just above that, maybe specification required, that we would then in that guidelines to policymakers document say, hey, when you specify what works in your jurisdiction, you need to specify which of the things in this registry people need to pay attention to. So it leaves the decision-making power in the hands of policymakers, but we give them affordances to make that easy.
My experience with policymakers, policies to the ones I call is that is something that they are trying to dodge. They would much prefer
They'd
like
rather-
somebody else makes it.
Yeah,
So this there's a whole political like thing around here that makes it's complicated.
Right. We could also put a field in the registry that is, we'll allow anybody to get in the registry, but these ones are recommended or whatever. And then they could say, we all recommended ones or whatever. But we will have to have those discussions.
Ben?
So I'm working through the practicality of how I would evaluate this from as a user perspective. If I don't have a list of registries, and I put a little bit in the chat, if I don't have a definitive list of the mechanisms, how do I know when I've looked at all of the mechanisms I should look at? And if we leave it up to policymakers to say, in my territory for this purpose, here's the list, and in this other territory for a different purpose, here's this list. The internet's global. How do I know what list in what territory applies at any given moment? This is going to create chaos for adoption because you won't know which list to follow and you won't know which mechanisms. And by the way, what happens if, without this registry, if tomorrow somebody does come out with a format for mock, but nobody tells everybody that this thing exists, and I don't have my tool looking at mock, if I don't have a registry that tells me mock has that, how do I even know to look at that or not? It's chaotic.
I think we will not get a definitive list at some point. Like, I think it's like impractical to have a definitive list. I understand the problem you're saying, but this is probably going to be like self-reporting.
We can't have like an IANA list that's managed by an expert.
No, we can, but like it doesn't mean like it's going to be a definitive list, right? I think there's a difference between having a list
There's
of known.
definitive, but then there is a definitive one time everybody recognizes. But then there is a well-known list of semi-official published. These are the well-known terms that a expert has accepted into that IANA published registry.
I think that's the policy stuff that like Mark was talking about, right? Like what is the policy to get into the registry and like do we have a flag or not is something we need to discuss at some point. I think let's go through the queue. I think timid robot.
I think this discussion is premature. I think that it's tied to reputation, enforcement, things that we've already ruled out of scope. Also, like there's a tremendous amount of information that is adjacent to this, right? Like we're not telling people how to set up a web server, right? Like there is an expectation that the people who use and implement this are going to be seeking it out and educating themselves and et cetera. So I also think that we're perhaps doing more hand-holding and trying to do more hand-holding than is necessary.
Thank you. Thijs?
Oh, no, that's.
Alyssa?
I would rather that we not be using the time to talk about this. It feels like either like a minor thing or a bridge that can be crossed at some point in the future. And just like really seems like non-essential to the getting the things done that need to get done by August. I also think like it feels like a sort of generic educational task that accompanies a lot of different protocol development that might happen in different standards organizations. So I don't really know what's specific to this in particular that warrants a detailed IANA registry with a registration policy and all of that. So it just seems like something we could talk about sometime in the future, but is non-essential.
Just as a reminder, since we're hearing people pushing back on the topic, we were talking about a list of issues. So if people have other issues about attachment that we need to capture, now's the time.
Sonia?
So if I understood this correctly, the attachment mechanism is essentially the implementation method for implementing vocabulary. And I think I have seen that as the essential part of the standard, because if we're just left with a vocabulary to adopt, we're no better off than we are under the position of Article 4, which basically says this is what we do, but doesn't explain how to do it. So I think we need certainty in terms of how to actually implement expression of this particular vocabulary. And I'm a little confused as to why that's kind of being put aside as something that is just in a registry and not kind of an essential part of the
No, it's not.
RFC.
So it's not just in a registry. We will still be publishing RFC
Okay.
for attachment. It sounds like from discussion 1.
And that will be in combination with the vocabulary.
Right.
So the vocabulary won't sit separately from the,
No, there'll be 2 separate documents.
okay.
Yeah.
But they'll both be published in the same time frame.
Right.
If that's your concern.
Well, it's that you can't necessarily commit to agree to a vocabulary without the implementation.
Right. But so what this discussion is predicated upon is that there are going to be more than one attachment mechanism.
Yeah.
Some of those mechanisms are not going to be defined by the IETF because the authoritative bodies for those formats are elsewhere.
Yeah.
And so, the purported need is how do you discover all of those things?
Oh, so it's a registry for protocols that are outside the scope of the.
For all of the attachment mechanisms. And to be very clear, and I did not want to face plant on this particular aspect, but a registry is one way to do that. There are many, many others.
Okay, thank you.
Well, yeah, so there's a concern from the rights holder side, right? Like that you use the vocabulary, use an attachment mechanism, and end up speaking to the void, which is, I think, one of the, because, so you need a mechanism that's keep it neutral, not a registry, to somehow establish which one, like which attachment mechanisms are used to express yourself, also listen to. I saw your question, Gary. Like, I think that's more complicated than saying like either you only need to listen to one or you need to robots needs to do all. Like obviously, like a web crawler probably does not need to go into sort of complicated things like the sort of registry-based approach that Sebastian is building on, but other types of content acquisition pipelines might need to honor information that is in there. So like I think it is a much more complicated and I think unfortunately essential part of this, because we see this dynamic playing out in the code of conduct at the moment in the discussion, where the sort of AI companies all say like, robots.txt is good enough for everything, right? And on the other hand, the rights holders say in various degrees, no, we know there's no shortcomings, it doesn't cover embedded stuff well, it doesn't necessarily convey information that comes from rights holders if we're not also the content publishers, etc., all those things. And they insist on that there need to be other ways for them to communicate the thing and to be ensured that they will be listened to. This is this two-step problem between the two things. And like I think we need a mechanism in the middle that somehow the answer can't be like listen to, like you need to implement whatever student project that sort of is based on that vocabulary that says like I'm using this vocabulary because that creates madness. But the answer can't also be like it's sort of entirely voluntary what you listen to, because then this situation where you don't know what to invest in, like where you invest like your expression into as a rights holder or other type of like their carrying party is also you have no certainty, right? There is a piece that needs to be addressed. I'm not entirely sure if that is ours here or policymakers. It's a work item that maybe is not part of the role, but somebody needs to address that.
We should have an answer to that question, even if it is, we're not doing it.
And one thing, like, it usually resolves around some concept of widely used. Sort of.
So I think can I just make one small intervention before you? So I think somebody said it, IETF is not the protocol police, right? So I think we don't have the enforcement mechanism to say these are the things everybody must listen to. As long as that's clear, I think we can do other stuff like Mark was saying, but I think that needs to be there, that we cannot enforce this somehow. And I think Miriam was pointing out, there could be a policy law thing that kind of talks about the discovery on the chat, but yeah.
Right. And I'll leverage your leveraging and say, we're trying to identify something that policymakers can hold on to and point to and say, do that to meet these requirements. And so the shape of that handle is important,
Just don't underestimate that many policymakers will have concerns relating to specific things. Like, for example, CP2A, which is sort of run by a company. You cannot, as a policymaker, just go you need to use commercial product X in order to do something. Because that's but
open standards are good.
Yeah.
TM.
Martin?
You stole what I was going to say.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Chat privilege.
I also would very much like not to be discussing this topic. But Paul's point is a good one, which is to say we can define mechanisms. We don't decide how they're used, and nor do we have any special responsibility in that regard, other than perhaps to advocate for the value of the things that we define over perhaps some alternatives. And that comes later, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about the mechanism by which we do that. I think that's a waste of the time here. I would rather talk about other issues. Can I talk about other issues?
Such as?
Robots text. I think the timeliness aspects of that we were discussing during the break probably could benefit from some discussion in this room, because there's a couple of aspects of that I found surprising, and I would very much like to get on the record some answers to questions, or at least just the questions.
Go for it.
All right. So,
can we join the queue on this, before, if somebody has to make a short statement?
I'm hearing that we're at diminishing returns on that discussion.
No, but we don't know what they're waiting for. That's kind of why. Unless it's not about this, we can just keep forward.
Well, so if who else?
Timid, Robot, and then Sebastian.
Can we keep it quick?
My name is Timid Robot, and I just want to again push back on the idea that we are providing a complete solution or something that will make rights holders happy. We just need to do a good beginning.
No, I acknowledge. Sebastian, quick.
I think my position on registry is clear with regards to the attachment. It's just my question to get an understanding. Do we need to talk about attribution or about identification of the declaring party, especially when we consider opt-in signals as preference signals, because in that context it can be getting horribly wrong, I would say, if we don't. Could that be something to be discussed in such a context of an attachment?
So right now, authenticating and authorizing parties is out of scope for our charter.
It's what? Sorry.
Out of scope in our charter.
Okay.
Martin, back to you.
Yeah. So that does not mean that we don't recharter in future that
Sure.
expand the scope of the work that we're doing, but we have a very specific
Not
scope
now.
right now, and I'd like to make sure that we deliver. And August is insane in terms of timelines. But the issue that I would like to get to in that spirit is if I have obtained some content, and what expectations would you set for the robots.txt that applies to that context? So there's an expression in the robots.txt file that says, I would like you to treat content in the following way. What expectations do you have with respect to time with that content that I've just obtained? Say I obtained robots.txt immediately beforehand. Say I obtained robots.txt immediately afterwards. Say I obtained robots.txt a day ago. How about a week ago? How about a month ago? That sort of question is one that I would like to have asked. And then, what if robots.txt doesn't say anything about preferences? And I would like to know if it's been updated since I obtained the content. What can I then say about that? And the discussion that we had at lunchtime sort of was surprising to me, but I think is probably worth repeating here, is that most of the crawler operators who were both present at that discussion, tell me if I'm doing this wrong, they regard robots.txt as available for around 24 hours, typically refresh on a 12-hour, 24-hour cycle, that sort of thing, so that they always have a relatively fresh version of it. And they would consider that to apply to the content that they obtain within that window, and would refresh if they were to obtain outside that window. Right. Then, if they hold on to content and later use it, they would check both that the robots.txt still says the same thing and that the content is present before using that content.
Right. And the interesting.
So,
I want to be super. I want to make sure that I understand your scenario well.
Right.
If we fetch something last August,
yes,
and the robots has been updated,
yes,
we will not reflect this change in the search experience right away. This is poor current behavior.
That's fair.
So we will still display snippet and so on. We won't, if your robot is other things, we have still the oldest version of the content.
Right.
This is what we do today.
So just to be absolutely clear, the applicable version of robots.txt is that which was fetched contemporary to when the content was fetched.
Yes. Right. This is during this time. There is a time to live of the robots, and during this time we apply whatever rules is applied to the robots.
And that applies to both search indexing and an AI training? I mean, I realize it's not used for AI training.
That's why we don't use the robots for AI training. Google is different on that. And there is, again, we are looking at this AI standard to define the rules across the landscape to apply the rules. What is the primary, what is the secondary in terms of tags, and so on.
So then that answer could vary.
This needs to be defined. Yes.
And this is the sort of thing that I would like to understand. Absolutely. Is what would be the expectations that exist. Yeah. We'd have to write this down around what applies at the time of usage versus the time of acquisition and that sort of thing. So we have a few.
Yeah. Paul, did you have a clarifying question or?
Yeah, it's a little bit. It may also not be instructive to talk to search engine operators in this context. Like, I think it's also relevant to see like behavior of entities who do not operate a search engine might sort of have larger delays between crawling, like for training purposes. Like that's probably more likely one-time events. So
right.
Robot.
Can you go?
Okay. Yeah. My name is Stuart Robot. Yeah, and I just wanted to, I guess, plus one. I would love for there to be a definition of kind of when do the preference signals become stale, so that we can address the problem of, for example, common crawl data being used for training, potentially a long time, whatever that feels like after it was acquired. Yeah. Thank you.
Joe?
A lot of people express concern about public crawls of data that are then used by people to scrape, with a clear distinction between crawling and scraping in some people's minds. And the concern is that it's all well and good when you're crawling to let that lie on a big database of image text pairs, through a step robot or something similar, but actually what rights holders often want is for people who are about to train to check the status of preferences as close to training as possible. It's then maybe worth considering do we want to have different standards of how often things have to be updated for search engines, which Paul pointed out is a very particular use case as opposed to training in general. There are nice tools, spawning for checking the opt-in or out status of a URL in one line of code. It's not unfeasible to imagine somebody doing a relatively small training run to check, if I'm going to train on the following batch, this graded descent step, I can also check the preferences for this batch as well. These things they seem to be quite possible, but I don't know if anybody has objections to doing things that close to training time.
I think Ted had a question for you about analysis and the difference between scraping and crawling.
So again?
You want to know what he meant by scraping that's different from
So I think that this is sometimes exaggerated as they're different, but people talk about it a lot as if they really, really care that there's a clear difference.
They do, and there is, and they do.
Okay, fine. So for some people, crawling is looking to map the internet, and it has really important applications for both search, but also kind of academia, Google Common Crawl, mapping the web, sociology of the internet, all this kind of stuff. And people say, well, crawling is great, it's an important social good. And then scraping is the making of copies. And this is when the copyright stuff kicks in because, well, I'm now downloading a copy of your text or your image to my server so that I can embed it and train on it. And that's what people might object to. So scraping then crawling is important, as well as the fact that they're often two different users. I'm a tech startup, I maybe can't afford to run my own crawler, so I'm going to go use Books3 and Lion and whatever else to get started. I'll do no crawling at all. I'll just be scraping. So robots and preferences have to matter for scrapers, not crawlers sometimes.
Yeah, we should be very careful. Those are, the definitions vary, there's not even consistency and agreement across multiple groups as to those terms. But if we should, when we start writing up our documents, we should agree on our terms and just, as long as we're consistent, it doesn't matter.
I've got no love for the particular label.
I understand, and that's why I'm not picking on you one way or the other.
So I have one quick comment to Martin's point. Martin said, hey, we should set the expectation. But I'm just thinking there's probably going to be a spectrum of expectations. I think it'll be good that we can specify something that we want to see, but also talk about what are the things that we know about. Probably collect some things we know about, saying, hey, these are the things that are being done currently. Might be a good idea to just document things that we know about. Thoughts? Like what Sabri said, hey, we keep the robust text at fetch time, that's what we obey. And maybe somebody else has a different view of things, so maybe just start putting them down.
I think we have a transitionary problem to deal with in this space as well, because until we define something, no one can really use it.
I understand, that's what I'm saying. So these are things you know about, this is what we expect to happen. Going forward, it's probably what we need to do. And Mark, you.
Yeah, so yeah, just as me. This is a problem that I was thinking about before we started any of this, and I went as far as writing a blog entry about it. I think that one of the elephants in the room is that a lot of training was done and a lot of scraping was done before anybody had any idea what was going on. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of rights holders are feel powerless because that data has already escaped their control. Mm-hmm. And so I guess my conception to start with was, well, we can define robots.txt to apply in such a way that if something was scraped, the interesting case for me is if something was scraped or crawled or whatever you would call it 3 years ago. Obtained 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm training a model right now. We could say that the applicability of robots.txt is such that I have to check it right now. Mm-hmm. That's the time of application. That is one option open to us. But there's some interesting bumps on that. And I think that's the discussion that came out over lunchtime is that, as we talked about the distance between robots.txt and the reality of the bits on the wire, the structure of the site can change over time. And so there are some real questions about whether that is intentional if I disallow or allow training on a particular path, whether that was still applicable 3 years ago or not, and whether that maps to the reality of the website. And that's one hairy problem. This transitional problem that Martin mentioned is another. The only other thing I'd say is that in talking to some legal folks about this, there are some who interpret the TDM exception to apply very strictly, in that when you obtain data and you rely upon the TDM exception, that it is only good for that purpose. And once you perform that purpose, you have to throw that data away. And so that changes the dynamics here yet again. I'm not sure how, and of course that's outside the scope of this group, but yeah, this is a really rich area that I think we should at least figure out what we need to say about.
Yeah, I think it's much more difficult with something like robots that text, where it is somewhat more at arm's length. All of these indirect systems have that property. Whereas if it's attached to the content and it has a life cycle that matches the content, which is true of an HTTP header as well.
Sure.
Then it's less ambiguous. This content has these preferences attached to it. End of story, more or less.
For now, because this HTTP header may change tomorrow, next day, next week. And so then we have to refetch it to discover the new.
Right, and we have this transitionary problem.
Yes.
First,
I said it first, so I said it in chat. So as somebody who has had legal training, we usually don't apply rules retroactively because of certainty and fairness issues. And I'm not so sure that I think we should discuss this more, whether it can be actually applicable like 4 years later. What if, there are various scenarios that could also the crawler or the agent could actually become liable for something for something that has been applied retroactive, and I don't like that in my legal mind.
Timid robot. I really like the idea of this existing, but I also wonder if it is also tied to a later phase, reputation, enforcement, and when I try to imagine when this would matter and how it would matter, like I imagine like maybe an accrediting body has like silver, gold, diamond level like preference, right? And that there might be different definitions of like how they treat robots.txt and how current it is or when they update it, etc. But I'm not convinced that it is necessary for our work here. Thank you.
I kind of agree. I think, well, having a mechanism that says I make a commitment that my signaling is stable for a certain time, that's very useful because technically then you don't have to refresh it before that time. But anything else about when you should fetch it, if you should fetch it for data you got in the past or whatever, it's nothing that changes the technical mechanisms we have here. And it's really not our decision and nothing we can really have, I think, give any useful recommendation on that. So we should not talk about it.
Yeah, in terms of the retroactive application, I do think that there is some merit, and I'm not sure if it's in scope to discuss that, but I do think that this is one of the reasons why we have proposed AI.tax as a specific mechanism for retroactively applying preferences across data that has already been aggregated into data sets, sort of like the pre-AI web or whatever we want to call AI, but I think we know kind of what we mean. Where people, more common users, typically rights holders, but not exclusively, said, oh wow, I didn't understand how this worked. I actually don't want my data to be trained on. Maybe that goes out of scope and that's not necessarily the consideration of this, but this is one of the reasons why we developed AI.tax was to provide a mechanism for retroactive application for data that is in existing data sets, which, again, to further complicate the scraping and crawling debate, these are big lists, right? Links that are active on websites. So when this is retrieved now in our post-AI world, but there is a mechanism to check against and go, oh, okay, this person doesn't want their data training, right? Looking at robots.txt and the schema that we're proposing here, maybe that's the best place to look for that. I recognize that this registry-based approach and this checking mechanism is definitely out of scope, but it's something to consider. This is one of the reasons why I brought up the timing dimension of this as potentially being a limiting factor if we're thinking about this. Anyway, just putting that out there.
Paul? I would, so like I agree timing dimension is important. Like I think we should limit ourselves to going like the use of whatever comes out of it going forward, going into there's very strong feelings around what happened in the past. There are sort of also complicated questions, like if you go into the legal environment, like the introduction of the TDM exception isn't that far away. So there's intersection about changes in the law in the past, like there's questions around transparency, how do you verify anything around this? I think this is like there is something that in an ideal world we could write that by proposing something. I think that is that's simply impossible. So I think we should pay close attention to sort of any timing relevant stuff going forward, but that's not try to fix history. And I think there's other ways of this. Like, I don't know, like I was intrigued by the report that you had with like some idea about like a retroactive like grant licensing thing that fixes some kind of like some injustice that may have happened in the past. That's how I read it. But I think that's maybe something for a government or some other forum to address, not this.
Thank you. Okay. So one of the ways we could address this is just, if we're writing something somewhere that guides policymakers and others on how to conceptualize this, we can just note we don't address retroactive use. That's out of scope for this, and that if they want to address that, they need to use some other mechanism.
Okay. Gary?
What if we say something similar to what robots.txt, like RFC 9309 has at the moment, which is you have to refresh every 24 hours, but instead of saying that, you say that when you're training, and you're using more oral language, but when you're training, then you have to recheck the preferences for those assets.
But so you're proposing, I think, that you would, if you had old data, you would check the new policy.
Yeah.
That is one thing we could write.
Like my understanding is that our AI teams operate under this thing already, like with Google Extended, and it seems to be working.
Do you check that the content is the same at the same time?
I have no idea.
Yeah, because the reason I ask is that the content could have changed.
Meaning like the link would be the same?
No, say you obtain something and then 3 years later you want to use that something. You would update the preferences from robots.txt or what have you that were associated with the original thing. And the original thing has long since changed multiple times. What does the new expression apply to?
Your certainty about the connection between the policy and the data is
Right,
huge.
it starts getting a little bit squishy.
That's the disconnect between crawling and scraping, right? Crawling is a process that happens over here, and then you go to acquire the data, and that's the scraping process. At least we're thinking in an AI context, right? So I think you're totally right. That delta is security vulnerability, right? Or like again, just there is.
No, it's just a matter of. It's really just a question of what is the applicable preference. What did the person expressing that preference intend?
I think that is one of the structural limitations of any location-based attachment mechanism, right? Like that what is that allocation change? Like, are there any mechanisms, metadata-based, hash-based things, like provide much stronger assurances here that the information stays with the content over time? Yep.
Can I go on?
My name is Timid Robot. So there's a mention of, is it Gary?
Yes.
Thank you. Robots.txt and its time requirements. Martin mentioned headers and time associated with headers. And so I'm wondering if, to me, it sounds like maybe for the kind of the future looking stuff, ignoring the interactive stuff, that this is an attachment problem and is up to the kind of the attachment implementation to figure out to some degree. Thank you.
So this is an interesting, I'm going to throw this out there as an interesting wrench in the works. So question to Gary, and I just looked over 9309 and it's ambiguous. And it's based on something Martin just said. There's nothing in the current 9309 that implies that it talks about URIs.
Yes.
It does not imply that they are referenced over the HTTP quote unquote protocol. So that in theory, any protocol that can retrieve it, FTP, Gopher, whatever, okay, so robots does apply to any protocol, it's not HTTP specific.
Yeah, and we're using it for FTP, for example.
Okay, so yeah, okay. Yeah, so,
Thanks.
okay, so it just clarifies, so
Now I
this
need
is
to
not
update your
HTTP specific, thank you.
I need to update one on your eyes now, thank you.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, what we said, I just lost it. It's okay, I will.
We spoke about prioritization of, let's say, HTTP header versus robots and overwhelming. Maybe there is a default registry rules, and maybe we should offer also the ability for, let's say, site owners and publishers to decide what they prefer. Because to cover one scenario, maybe for some publisher they want they know that the crawler will not be able to recrawl the content because they have limited bandwidth. But still they want to let the crawler access the content. And so you may want to specify that this specific crawler or all crawler have allow or disallow preferences based on robots versus content or vice versa. And so maybe the rules need to be specified. There is the default, and site owner, publisher can override.
So it sounds like what you're suggesting is, we're talking about adding purpose as a selector in robots.txt. You would also add a time dimension as a selector as well.
Not time selector, but most about what you are preferring. The default should be, my point of view, that what is closest from the content win, meaning this is the HTTP header or the meta tags, but maybe the publisher can override that to say, okay, for my sites, no, for this user agent or all user agents, I will prefer that the rules is that the robots win.
Okay, also get back
Thanks. So I just wanted to say, yes, so Gary mentioned that they do check the updated.
That's what I think. I don't work on the Google AI.
But also like Gary, you're Google. We have to also think about.
I'm not.
No,
Please don't do that.
Congratulations.
Please don't
I
do
know,
that.
okay, yeah, no, I'm just saying that we have to think about other actors that don't have the means and don't have they don't have the technical expertise. That's what I meant. I didn't want to single out. I wanted to say that when you think about other agents that don't have the technical expertise that others have, then we have to also think about how can we facilitate it for them not to look at the to be able to get the technology to actually look at that update, that the robots.txt update. So to show, facilitate their good faith by not making it complicated for them. Because if we are saying that they have to, if we, in the future, if we say that they have to, every time they want to use the data for a specific purpose, they have to look at the instructions of the robots.txt. If we are requiring that, then we have to also facilitate for the commoner AI agent to be able to, first of all, know that detail and how to technically do it. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear.
No, I think I'd relate that to the discussion we had earlier, which was that, for different use cases, it may be that, we need to be more specific about which attachment mechanisms are appropriate, or something new.
Yeah, Martin?
Yeah, so there's a very sort of, I guess, HTTP legalistic definition, and I'm going to that sort of would allow us to solve this problem, which is to say that if the content itself is no longer fresh, then the preferences are no longer fresh. Therefore, you would be expected to go and check for both the content and the preferences. And this applies to both robots.txt and the content that it refers to. That's one approach we could take here that would be relatively straightforward. And I suspect it may not actually accomplish the ends that we.
Yeah, heuristic freshness will kill you on that one.
And I think you would have to take a very strict freshness thing.
But freshness isn't strict.
Right. Let's leave that aside for a moment. That's a hugely legalistic argument on things. But I think there's a number of things that we need to separate out. Gary's answer on the HTTP versus FTP thing. Maybe look at the robots.txt spec and like, oh boy, that needs updating.
Yep. Very much so.
You can't have HTTP speak for FTP, and it can't be arbitrary schemes.
Right.
That,
the scheme needs to opt into that convention.
The what?
The scheme needs to opt into the convention.
Yes. You can't have it apply to URN blah 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 robots.txt because it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
You can't have it apply to mail to,
right,
for instance. So the scheme needs to opt in.
Unless they match.
No, it's just not going to work. Because the scheme needs to understand that it's got this reserved space for it. And
there's a whole RFC about that.
Yep. But that aside, I think I have enough information that I could sort of work out some sort of proposal here that would make a degree of sense. I think there's the 24-hour thing in robots.txt is a pretty good anchor for that side of the equation. I think that the other side of the equation is a little less clear, but the idea that there would be some expectation that you go back and check that the content is still there and has the same preferences before using it is a reasonable thing to say. I don't know if that fits the test that we just had from PASS about that being easy for someone who intends to use that content, but I think that's a reasonable basis to start from. If that makes sense to you.
But I mean, that's just something you would put in a document that doesn't imply any technical fix or anything.
So all we can ever do in this is establish expectations of how we expect the preferences and the attachments to be interpreted by the people consuming it.
Right.
And we don't want to get into legal interpretations. We just want to make sure that we define very clearly how we expect a preference to propagate from someone who's expressing it to someone who is consuming it.
Exactly.
The preference stays. That's where our responsibility ends.
Okay. Lars, is your queue thing lingering or is it?
No, I don't have anything else.
Okay. Gary?
So first, let me express my surprise about the URI thing because I specifically left the draft on the mailing list for a very long time, like 3 years, because it was like
When these things are
We'll handle it,
it happens.
but it doesn't have to happen here, so
Yeah.
we'll figure it out.
And the second thing is a question. Why can't we just rely, and perhaps it was already answered somewhere, why can't we just rely on 9111, like on HTTP caching?
It's exactly the debate that Mark and I were having at high speed that no one else understood.
Yes.
There's a bunch of complexities in the caching rules that mean that they don't necessarily like straightforward apply.
There are two levels to this. One is that HTTP caching is designed to be greedy. So we have heuristic caching. If you don't specify any specific explicit caching policy, it is up to the client to decide how long to cache things using heuristic, which it defines. The other is that HTTP caching is really an HTTP internal semantic. It is for the purposes of what I would call transport, except that Roy Fielding would wake up and come over here and kill me. Applications usually define their own concept of lifetime as a result. And so
it's not going to fit very well.
It's not going to fit terribly well.
The other point is that if you're training an AI model, the content that you're feeding into that model doesn't expire just because your cache expired.
Right.
Some intermediary or
exactly.
The content is still
persistent.
Content.
Yeah.
Right. So tying it very closely to the caching rules, which really govern updates and things like that.
The analogy is if I have my web browser and I go to your web page and your web page says that this image expires in an hour, and I leave my browser open, the image doesn't disappear in an hour. It's still on my screen.
But if I visit the URL again, then it will not be served from the local cache. It will be
Exactly. But that's for the purposes of HTTP caching.
But that's technically because the content is higher.
Right. But you're still using the content afterwards because it's being displayed on your screen.
The crawler has no guarantee to be able to fetch and download the content. We have content that we never downloaded for 15 years. Because we don't have enough capacity.
But I mean, it's also promised that the content won't change during the caching.
No, it's not a promise.
It's not a promise.
It
No,
won't
it's
change
not at all. It's just an optimization.
It's if there's explicit freshness, then it's an acceptance that if the content does change on the server, the
server is okay with that.
Is accepting of the fact that maybe it won't update in some browsers. But you can
They might show no
force a reload that will go back to the server. There's all sorts of things. This doesn't line up very well.
Gary? Joe?
I wanted to echo what you previously said. By far, I think about this being useful for small developers as well as big developers. I think obviously, like in the volume of traffic, it's very important to have people who do lots of traffic on board understanding this. But I think part of the motivation for thinking about opt-outs is to make sure that these kinds of technologies are available to developers big and small. And if you made a very, very complicated solution that required quite a lot of infrastructure to handle concepts of freshness, that would be like counterintuitive. You shrug, but like it's one of the motivations for allowing this to happen in the first place. Otherwise, you go back to okay, like no AI scraping is allowed. Go get licenses.
So I shrug because like before joining Google, I wrote my own search engine. So it's not like I don't know development.
Okay, fine. But I think we'll have first thing we should bear in mind is kind of mark of success for projects. The other thing is that there's lots of talk about freshness, and I wonder if this is like potentially out of scope. This is that we can either leave, given that these are preferences, we keep reminding ourselves. Either players will say, this is architecture of freshness, this is how we do stuff, like it, you don't like it, or individual governments who are relying on the TDM protocols to define how copyright works, for example, will say, when you read RFC XXX, you must interpret freshness as this frequently, and we can wash our hands of this like nitty-gritty detail.
Right. To me, it comes back to what affordances do we allow for that sort of discussion.
So surely we want that to be defined by industry, because I think freshness, for example, will have technical constraints and optimizations. You don't want someone else dictating what it should be.
And I think that's a good reason for government to talk to industry about it, perhaps in a particular case. And I can't see a world where like governments all over the world and industry like diverge spectacularly on this issue. But it seems I think lots and lots of time talking about a relatively small like technical aspect of it that will matter the most for
big developers who've got separate crawling and scraping, apologies for the vocabulary, separate crawling and scraping operations, this comes in very, very important. There are then individuals who are not doing any crawling at all and just doing scraping. You need to look at the government guidelines and say, oh, I do actually have to probably check the permissions of the type of training, if that makes sense. But yeah, absolutely, industry should be involved in conversations. But it doesn't mean to decide this in this room, in this project.
So Sonia can speak up a bit less for the remote people.
Oh yeah, no, sorry, it was just a comment on just, not just freshness, but other aspects of standards development and choosing which standard. I think naturally industry will kind of gravitate to the right decisions, and government, I think, has a role to put the policy framework in place.
So we have that list of issues regarding attachment. It seems like we've made some progress with it. So I think what we'll do is what we discussed. We'll get some editors, get a document ready for adoption, do a call for consensus to adopt that document. We'll also establish an issues list, and we can use that to focus those discussions. We hope to see other proposals of various sorts that target those issues. Undoubtedly, we'll discover other issues along the way, but I think that's how we'll try to progress the discussion. We have a little less than 15 minutes left today, and then we have tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning is a truncated session. So when we were talking about this in the break, we thought maybe we'd try to squeeze in a little discussion of that nice combination problem of how do you reconcile multiple preferences discovered through multiple attachment mechanisms. What might that look like? And Yari, I think you had some thoughts about that you wanted to share.
Yes, so you want to do it now or?
Let's go.
Yeah, okay. Actually, somebody can share. You guys
Let me
share?
try to do it.
So I sort of noted down some observations of this on a couple of slides. And so the first question is like, what is the problem? Even if you sort of already narrow it down to like, what file are we talking about? What file of content? Even then you have still a problem of potentially getting multiple preferences for that single file. And those could come from potentially there could be like multiple header entries for in a single HTTP response. But at the very least, if you go to the next slide, at the very least you could have something from the robots.txt, something from the HTTP exchange, and maybe something even from the file itself, NVIDIA content, some policy inside that, and possibly also through some reference elsewhere. So there's multiple sources, and then there's some more special cases that are listed here. Probably don't need to go into, but one special case that we do need to go into, that there are potentially some things that are not communicated. That I'm not telling you, like I have some content on my website and you're fetching it. I'm not telling you what the laws are in this particular place that I have my website in, and you're not sending me or anybody else the laws that apply to you. There might also be some agreements between us and so on. And those are not sort of communicated over IETF protocols, but they still apply to us. So if we go to the next slide, switch. And so for the different kinds of things, so if there's information that is actually communicated using these preferences that we're going to standardize, then hopefully it is the case that we constructed those preferences in a way that we can combine them with some sensible algorithm. We'll get that algorithm then. But it's another story for the information that we don't have. Click once more. Obviously, if we don't have the information, then like it's an IETF specification can't really say anything about the information. It could, for instance, be specified in a manner that we don't really have any jurisdiction over, or might conflict with things. Like you could potentially, like law could say that certain things are always allowed. Let's say for accessibility, you can always do this, and somebody's opinion about their rights as a rights holder might disagree with that. But generally, government laws win over other things. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say here, that there is this set of information that we need to take into account in some fashion, but it's not really like visible to us, and it might have some special properties. And my recommendation after looking at this was that this is sort of outside the IETF specification. We need to recognize its existence, but it's not our problem to solve. And we shouldn't get hampered down on worrying about it. However, the thing that we can do is the information that has been specified by us and we understand and is available to us if we click once source. And that is something that we need to be able to do, I think. If we can't do that, then there's something wrong with the model that we've constructed. And it's possible that we might end up in that if there's some legacy stuff that we need to work with, and then there's a new thing that we want to be different, and you can't reconcile them. But that, if we get to that, let's worry about that at that point. The thing is, like, what is that algorithm if the robots.txt says something and the HTTP request says something else, and maybe the file says something third, then what do we do? And Martin's draft, for instance, was saying that the algorithm is basically that if anybody says no, then it's a no. And I think that's the only defensible position that we have. There's several parties, like we as the IETF, or we as the receiver of information in some system, really have no way of knowing like who's actually right, who's the real rights holder, who has the power over the others. The only sensible thing to do, the only safe thing to do is to say no if someone says no. The most limited rights that apply. That's it.
Can I just add clarification?
Yeah.
Let's assume that we go down a path where there is, this hierarchical sense of general versus specific. And let's say that someone in the more general context of, let's say, robots.txt says no for, something broad, but then somewhere specific, like in an HTTP header, they say yes to something that's contained within that, like Gen AI. What you're saying is you still pay attention to the no, correct?
Well, this seems to be two different structures here in
Right.
my view. So there's one is this hierarchy of content that slash this and slash something else underneath. So I didn't consider that at all. That was like a separate problem. But then, of course, you have, like, for a particular item, we already narrowed down the particular item. We know what policies apply to it based on what we hear from here and from there and from there. Then how do we combine those? And it is possible that you have this situation that there's one general class and one more specific class. Then we need to combine them in a way that,
right,
again, respects this. If anybody says no, then that is what should apply. If somebody says, let's say the website says TDM no and nothing else, and then the image file says sure, go ahead, then it's still a no. In my opinion, that's at least a logical way of thinking.
Clarifying question. Is this only a situation where you've got one piece of content, but you've got multiple signals within like one domain for it? Or you also talking about situations where over here there's a copyrighted work and its headers say yes, but there's another copy of the same work on a different server and its robots.txt says no?
It was about the former, like one object. Of course, there's like, you have copies that we don't know if they actually are the same thing. You have, like we talked earlier today about this, derivative works, made, based on some of the same ingredients, but by different people. Those are different problems.
Okay.
Not sure we have technical means to deal with that.
But we could say, once again, we don't address that issue in what we produce.
Okay. So we have a pretty long line. Ted?
So I agree that the currently practical algorithm for August is most specific, most restrictive. That is, the most specific thing you have relating to the same content should be considered first, and the most restrictive thing, the things that apply to the content should be done. And if you don't know which is most restrictive, you treat them as equal, and that's probably going to end up with most restrictive. being no in these cases. So I think that's relatively easy to reason about. And between now and August, I think punting the jurisdictional questions completely is absolutely the right thing to do. I think we're going to have to take account of it, not necessarily between now and August, but at some point in the future, if some jurisdiction says, this is how you express the signals relevant for my laws. That doesn't mean we are going to take their context and apply something about how it merges with anything else in the preference signal. But it may be something that we do have to think about as we're doing this, because at some point somebody may reapply these rules as the law says this is how you walk out. And there are consequences to that we're going to have to deal with, but not between now and August. But on the question of if you get multiple copies, I think, again, between now and August, the right thing to do is to treat the copies as part of two different corpuses, and whatever you would do with two different corpuses, you do here. But in the longer term, I think that may be a moment where we reconsider how we do the most specific, most restrictive, to say the closest to the object wins. If you've got two copies of the object which both say the same thing, and two different sources which say two different things, you may at some point say, I'm going to believe the object. Again, between now and August, I don't think we should do that, but it is something that we may want to consider as a change that we might do in the future, and that means we have to make sure the syntax allows us to do that in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, sir. Robot.
My name is Timid Robot. I think it's really important to be very clear that most specific is fully resolved, and then after it's fully resolved, then you choose most restrictive.
That was my intention.
Okay, good. And then my understanding of what you said, Ted, is that potentially in the future there might be some sort of room for automatic resolution of kind of weighting different inputs on how complex interaction is done.
No, I was saying that at some point in the future, we may revisit this if we find, for example, you get 6 copies of an object, the interior to the object data all says the same thing, but the robots.txt of one of those 6 said something different. You may at that point say, I'm going to trust that the expression is the majority, but we're not going to make that the algorithm today. Today, I think the only thing we're going to be able to finish between now and August is most specific and most restricted, but that we should have a syntax that allows us to update that if experience warrants.
Great, I love that. Thank you.
Paul?
Yeah, I think the robot maybe stated what I wanted to say. There's another dimension here, which nobody mentioned time, right? There's also newer, probably overruled older. Another dimension to this.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that we should or can say anything there, because as you said, it's like, if you want to be on the safe side, it's always safer to not use the data. In case you don't, that's also the case if you don't have any signal, or even if you have agreement preferences, it doesn't mean that you can automatically use the data. At the end, if you decide to use the data, you have to assess if it's safe on a legal basis for you to use the data, and these preferences are just like one thing that provide input for you to make that decision. And maybe it depends also on who's stating the preferences, when the preferences are stated, and so on. There's so many factors, so you can never rely on this anyway. So I'm not sure it provides any value to say anything there.
Yeah. Just a quick response. I think if we have hierarchy, we are required to say how to resolve that hierarchy. And it's really important because I might want to say TDM no, search yes, right? Or
search has to be permissible in that case.
Right.
And
so
I'll
if you
also mention that we're chartered to do this.
Okay, yeah, all right, thank you.
Sonia?
I think the hierarchy makes sense where there might be two conflicting designations or two designations where the intention is to say X, where say, for example, no generative AI training and AI training. What does that mean? It means everything but generative AI training. But it sounds like that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about different designations that are directly conflicting in potentially two different means. So I think there's a risk that we're considering this is a technical problem when it's not necessarily. So there could be conflicting designations for good reason. So maybe on a platform, the platform provider generally has an approach to opt everything out, but gives the users the ability to opt back in, or the other way around. And I think we can't assume that every conflict needs to be resolved, and actually there could be good reasons for the conflict. And maybe it makes sense for us to see how the opt-out is adopted, to see where the issues arise before we see it as a potential problem. Similarly, if you've got two different locations in the same media with two different opt-outs, it could be that the rights holder has provided the content to two different distributors instead, deal with the opt-out as ever you see fit. And I think we can't assume that it's a technical problem that needs addressing.
But I didn't hear that as what Yari was proposing, if I understand correctly. It wasn't about reconciling across the content that you got from two different sources.
Okay,
I think we're leaving that out of scope.
Okay, so if that's out of scope, then it is the case where we don't have two designations like no to AI training, but yes to generative AI, or the other way around. But it's having two designations that are in direct conflict, where you say no Gen AI and then yes to Gen AI. And they're potentially being provided by two different parties in relation to the same content. And I think there we can't assume that that's a problematic conflict. It might be a relevant conflict where, because of the arrangement on a platform, you need to look at another factor. I think assuming a one-size-fits-all on what could be a situation with multiple factors is too simplistic.
Practical use case to think about is that I provided an image file with some preferences, and then there's a website, a platform where I upload that, and they have a different policy than mine. So stuff can actually happen. There's a disagreement.
Right. I mean, I think what we're doing is constraining ourselves to the case where I go to Yari's website, and Yari's robots.tech says one thing, and then I fetch something, and the HTTP header says something else, and then I look inside the content. Let's say it's a PNG, and the PNG spec says you look for the metadata here, and it says again something else. What do I do? I think we're constraining ourselves to that case, correct?
Yeah, I can give a technical thing also that I set up my website in this way because I think it's more efficient to have this general policy, robots with TXT level and then something else on the profile.
But not if you got that same PNG from my website, for example.
No, but there still can be different actors who are set with different preferences because you might use a hosting service for your website.
Of course.
So
Of course.
It doesn't mean that these are somehow intentional.
Well, from an HTTP standpoint, it's one actor.
If I'm hosting my website somewhere, I might not have control.
It's an authority, of course. Yeah. But that's what we're constraining ourselves to, at least in Yari's proposal.
But how do I know that who's the authority? I mean, like if I know there's a hosting service, I can probably guess that the content owner is.
That's not your problem.
Yeah.
But I think there's
If
so
you're
many
the consumer of
constraints.
this content, you have no means of determining whether one source of the content has more of a right to have express
Exactly, but
preference
how
than
can
another.
I then provide some general rules about it?
That's exactly what Yari's proposed.
Right.
Is that in the absence of external information about which one to choose over another one, you have to assume the most restrictive once you resolve the specificity.
Okay. What do we say for you?
Okay, if you want to make a longer comment, Miriam, get in line and we can do it. Alyssa has been waiting for a bit. Alyssa, go ahead.
So I wanted to probe a bit on the idea that, or the assumption that seems implicit here that like more restrictive is more in line with the interests of this most specific actor. And I think that's not always true. Like in particular, in the case of, if we think this is going to be able to be used to signal preferences about non-commercial use or like, you know, scientific research, whatever, there definitely can be situations where, say, large social media platform expresses a preference for, you know, no crawling for non-commercial use, but like me as a person in the world, I want to make all of my, you know, art that I'm posting on this site available for non-commercial use. So I'm saying yes, site owners saying no. Why should most restrictive trump in that case?
It wouldn't.
Because of the specificity rule?
Correct.
Okay. So, okay, maybe I just misunderstood. So basically, like in that situation, then like if it's like literally the individual user who's setting these preferences, whatever they say is always going to trump whatever the site says.
I think what was maybe not said, and maybe I'm just making an assumption, is that unit-based preferences are more specific than location-based preferences.
Well, what if you have a website that publishes people's content, okay? They're specified a bunch of different policies. But specifically, the website owner says, look, I'm not providing services to AI search engines. I'm not supporting their crawlers. I'm not supporting their bots. So I'm going to put a default no to those uses. Shouldn't that trump it since they're providing the service?
Okay, I think we are like, this is a longer discussion. I think we can have that, Glenn, get in line. Like Tim and we also have to get in line. So we just like hear all the people and then we keep moving. So yeah, please do get in line. Thanks. Alyssa, are you done? Okay, thanks. Martin?
So I think what Yari outlined is exactly what I had in my draft. And so therefore I think that that's the only sensible way to say here. This question about obtaining the same content via different media or by different means is an interesting one. If we don't say anything about it, I think what will apply is that that is the most permissible of the paths that you follow. For exactly the sort of reasons that Glenn just talked about. If you have a hosting service that says, I don't want to provide a service to AI crawlers, that's not my purpose, I want to serve people, not robots, they might say no to AI training users, even though the content served on that platform and all the creators involved are perfectly happy for that to happen. If someone obtains that content, exact same content via another channel that says yes, then off they go. I think that's an entirely appropriate way to deal with this situation. And if we don't specify anything, that's what's going to happen. And I'm okay with that. We don't have to specify it. I don't think that's a problem that we have to solve.
Doesn't that censor stuff that's made publicly available?
Sorry, we do have a queue.
Yeah. Sonia, get in the queue and we can go on. Fabrice.
I think this is related to the duplication of content and the fact that we should not enter this area short term. This is the example of YouTube, where someone publishes a video and want to make it available to everybody. But you may have bad actors that are also publishing the same content with the rule, no, overwriting the other good guy. And so then this is a problem of people taking over illegitimately bad content. So this is really the CMS, the content publication that need to allow tags as appropriate, dedupe content, remove this content, and not the role of this protocol to deal with this.
Thank you. Joe?
I think that there is a risk of taking Martin's approach that becomes useless to people that are trying to implement this for copyright regimes. And I appreciate, you said many times, the only purpose of this, but if you have a rule that says when you're comparing between sources, the least restrictive rule applies, then that's pretty catastrophic for people who are trying to stop their work from diffusing into AI models. Because now I can copy the work from anywhere, put it on my website with permissive AI preferences,
and I didn't get it from my website. If I've understood you correctly.
Yeah, but we were talking about good actors and bad actors. All of these preferences can be stripped, and you can make a copy of
And
them.
if it's a self-contained
So-
workflow.
So we do have a queue. Let's try and keep the discipline.
But I think that for jurisdictions where like these kind of robots.txt preferences are going to be legally binding, hopefully, and we hope that activity is going to happen in these regions, which it may not do, but this is the aspiration. And I think just saying, wow, diffusion, let's let it go. Then why is the right order would even bother taking my preferences? No one's going to use this because it's going to get diffused away anyway, and the project becomes perhaps slightly moot.
But if you assume that bad actors are going to do that sort of thing, then there's nothing you can do through a system like this to stop that.
So
Unless-
Joe,
yeah.
This was discussed pretty extensively at the workshop, and it's the reason why we don't have enforcement in our charter. There's very limited things we can do about these problems with technical tools. So I think that's the kind of the background here, is that this is the agreement we came to in the charter.
And certainly within the time frame that we have.
Indeed, yes.
Okay, then I think I acknowledge that something in the charter, but I think it's bearing in mind that, for example, if you follow Jerry's approach for doing resolving conflicts in a particular location, that's great, and then it's another person's problem to decide conflicts between different people. That's great. We've got to make sure that if we do doesn't go too far to giving the ball game away, because that's also giving the ball game away outside our charter.
Where am I looking at? Because I
Two more, yeah.
I think there's a couple other things I want to say. That's it for now.
Thank you. Timid Robot?
Timid Robot, I do think there was a miscommunication. I only heard you say that like least permissive would kind of happen in certain situations, not that you were advocating for least permissive. I actually heard you say that you were advocating for most specific, most permissive as a defined rule. Maybe I misunderstood you as well.
I said most specific, least permissive.
Oh, right, most restrictive.
Yeah, most
Okay.
restrictive.
Okay.
Yep.
I think having a resolution path is very important, and that we won't be able to articulate preferences without a resolution path. And I do think that we need to decide on the interaction between location-based and unit-based and how those two interact in that resolution path, while also acknowledging that someone might, as an example, hit robots.txt and stop and never see content that is permissive, right? Like that, if robots.txt says don't interact with my content at all, then, and I respect that, I may not see that there's also content on that server that says you can do anything with this content unless someone, posts a specific URL to a forum or something, and I follow that specific URL. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
So I think I strongly support the most restrictive applies on a per transaction basis. We deal with this as a transaction fetch, a pull, the evaluation. The question about multiple copies, we don't deal with. That's out of scope because it doesn't matter. I can shop for least restrictive. That's a different discussion. That's an enforceability thing. So I think we just pull that out of scope. Go with least restrictive on a per transaction basis. Even if later on I come back and ask the same question, the same content source, I get a different answer, that's fine. For that transaction, the answer I get back at the time of the transaction is the one that applies. Nothing else. And we just don't deal with the rest of that stuff.
Thank you. Mark?
So just speaking as me, I think that we should play to our strengths here in that we're defining technical mechanisms. And so it's reasonable to design a mechanism when you're getting information from a single source, which is a website, to deconflict that information and to describe how to interpret it. But when we talk about, I think the implication for when it comes from different sources is that you want to place an obligation on someone to behave a certain way and to reconcile that. And that seems to be a problem that's much more appropriately addressed in a legal context rather than with technical means. Now, there may be technical mechanisms that can facilitate that. And I know that people have discussed those a little bit, but certainly creating those mechanisms is probably out of scope for us now because they're more like enforcement mechanisms and they take time. There are a lot of hairy issues in that. This is an area where mere preferences are probably not going to be adequate. Likewise, for the single site issue, where we all know there are big websites that have many users, and there's a tension in terms of what those sites allow those users to do and what they allow those users to express in their preferences, either by putting in robots.txt or stripping metadata from the things on those sites. Again, we don't really have technical means to address that problem. Policy means are much more appropriate to address that. If you're in a jurisdiction and they have strong opinions about this, they can tell those sites how to behave. So that's kind of my take on this. That's why this is the appropriate level to come in at.
As long as you don't, what's the word, stop.
Preclude, no, of course.
Preclude that negative.
And that comes again to we need to describe very carefully the issues that we don't address with this framework.
Okay.
Paul? So for me, coming back to that point, like nothing will work if we're thinking only about location-based in Angular. The scenario that you want, like somebody who writes of a large number of digital assets and freely circulate on multiple websites, location-based is not an approach that you should take to try to communicate with things. You need to do an asset-based approach. Otherwise, this will not work. And I think the most important thing is what I think was Ken Robot said, that was sort of the implied hierarchy here is that a asset-based preference signal should have preference over a location-based preference signal. I can't come up with a situation where somebody who operates a website should be trusted more over a statement with regards to an embedded image asset than the entity who has made the statement, who has embedded the statement into that image asset. Unless it's really that faith people and people go out like poison like lots of image. But like in general, like image circulate, image like photography is often present in like hundreds of different websites, right? Like there will be these conflicts. They are sort of a result of the way publishing works, and sort of the way to answer them is to express preferences as it is. And that needs to overrule like location-based when it comes to embedded assets.
So just to be clear, you're saying most specific should be the strategy.
Well, I don't know. Like there's two types of more specific. There's this sort of like the more specific attachment mechanism, right. But there's also a specificity in the hierarchical thing, right? Like, and I'm speaking of so in that sense, like more specific has a double meaning in this context, and so we need better words for expressing this.
Clarifying question. Is your model then that what we're doing here is saying if you have found the rights holder's original copy, then this working group will give you mechanisms to work out what their preferences are. But the question of finding where the rights holder is and what their genuine preferences are is out of scope.
We have no way of knowing what's the original copy.
Like
well, okay, whether that's possible, that is out of scope. Okay.
I mean, basically, it's you found the signals is what we're talking about. How you may find those signals. Right. That's we decided we'll get to like list of attachments, registries, blah blah blah. Like somehow you acquire the signals.
Sonia?
Thanks. Yeah, I think it should, and perhaps it's saying Paul said it needs to be kind of an asset base or something that is close to the content that isn't necessarily allowing a platform to dictate the terms of the opt-out. But I do think we do need to be careful about censorship. I think, with the example that you gave, what if you had a bad actor that just says no TVM, of one copy? I think you need to avoid that.
And legally they can't do that because the rights holder can make the opt-out under like the EU and UK proposals anyway.
Yeah, but we're not kind of
figuring
out who the rights holder is.
don't confuse rights owner with rights holder. If you're talking about the owner of media is a little bit different than the rights holder.
So media owner versus rights holder. Fine.
Also, there may be multiple rights holders.
You can have lots of rights holders, it can be very contextual.
And we're not gonna.
We're not gonna raise any.
Don't go there, because Lori's gonna be a lot of money to figure out who's the top dog.
Thank you. Fabrice?
I think I am hearing two different things. One is really default rules being the most restrictive, and one is closest to the content. And I do believe that at the end of the day, this is to come back to what I suggested. This is the default logic, and something that really can be expressed maybe per site, maybe via robots text file, that will allow to really kind of be override enforcement. Because I speaking to a lot of publishers and I see really the need from some publishers to say, no matter what, zero LLM training, period. Yeah. And somehow we have to respect that, and I think then this is maybe not the most closest to the content, because if allowed, then we will be able to do things. And I want to highlight also that most of the assets on the web in terms of images and web pages and HTTP things don't have restriction today. So the default will be that we will be allowed, maybe. And then if robots say not, then what we're doing, I mean, are we allowed or not allowed? So we have to think that some content is not tagged, and again, providing ability to allow, disallow, and enforce the default rule, I think need to be in place.
So that
we
just
exhausted the queue.
Fantastic. So we're almost at time. So that maybe seems like a natural stopping point. I think again, this is, one of our deliverables. We talked about probably including it in the vocabulary draft. So we'll create an issue. We'll track proposals there. We'll discuss this on the list and hopefully make some progress. Tomorrow, we have a, 2-hour, 45-minute session, I think. And we'll use some of that time to talk about next steps and especially potential for future meetings. I anticipate that should take no more than half an hour, let's say. And so if you can think tonight about what issues you want to talk about tomorrow, if there's another aspect of this that we can use this time productively in, we'll talk about that as chairs as well. We'll try to make a little more progress, because I'm pretty happy with the progress we're making. I think we're chunking through all the issues that we've identified, and at least getting an initial direction on them. We're going to need to see follow through on the discussions and the proposals to make real progress.
We have a 3-hour, 15-minute meeting.
3:15. We start at 9:15 and we end at 12, right?
12:30, yeah. It says 12:30 in the meeting, so.
I don't think that's true. I think we agenda 12. But,
okay.
But sure, if people can stay, we'll see how that
sounds good.
Just logistic, we do not have lunch tomorrow scheduled.
Right, thank you.
Be
Yes.
ready for that.
Yes, so we'll break and people will go out to lunch.
Airport lunch.
Many options at the local airport, I understand. So yeah, so that's us for today, and we'll see everybody at 9:15 tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, is there a Meet Echo tomorrow? Like it looked like it got canceled.
There is.
Yeah, did you see that?
I did check. So Alyssa, if you go look at the future meetings, you're gonna see it.
Go under future meetings, right? Number 6?
Yeah.
Number 6.
So it's meeting number 6. I'll post the meeting.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Thanks. Bye, remote folks. Thanks for keeping with us.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yes.